In this quiet corner of the night, you've wandered into Sleepy Saimo Foma, a space where questions soften, thoughts drift, and the world becomes gentle. Here, nothing asks for your attention. Nothing demands to be solved. You're simply invited to float, slowly, into a softer state of mind. The coral foamrites drift into view like a shoreline forming in low moonlight, and their world rises softly from the edges of the tide. They lived where the sea whispered against pale sandbars, on islands so thin they seemed to float. Their homes were built close to the water, always listening, always reading the slow breath of the waves. The coral believed the ocean was not an enemy to resist, but a living companion to shape. Their earliest stories described the sea as a patient elder, one who taught them that a coastline could be sculpted with care just as gently as a child shapes wet sand. They listened to the tides the way other civilizations listen to stars or prophets, noticing subtle swells, faint noises, drifting organic films, and slow seasonal shifts. The world around them was quiet, but their attention was sharp, almost instinctive, as if centuries of watching had tuned them into a kind of ecological intuition. The coral foamrites used this intuition to build something astonishing: living boundaries. They cultivated dense ribbons of foam-forming algae, coaxing them into growing along wooden frameworks made from driftwood and root systems. These structures were not barriers in the modern engineering sense. They were alive, always adjusting, always responding to storms and currents. When the tides grew harsh, the algae thickened, weaving into tough mats. During calm seasons, the mats loosened, filtering water gently and feeding the coastal ecosystems around them. To the coral, these living borders were not inventions. They were members of the community, tended with ritual and gratitude. They never forced the environment to bend, they invited it to collaborate. At the heart of coral knowledge was selective algal cultivation. Generations of foamrites studied the subtle differences among tidal algae species. Some produced long-lasting proteins, some captured silt, some trapped bubbles more easily, and some grew faster after storms. Instead of collecting written records, they preserved knowledge through pattern rituals. In long twilight gatherings, elders traced swirling shapes in shallow water, demonstrating how each algae strain behaved under different temperatures and salinity conditions. Young learners memorized these patterns not as static information, but as movements. This made their science embodied and fluid, knowledge carried not in symbols, but in memory, motion, and relationship. The geography of the coral lands shaped this culture. Their islands were shaped by shifting sand, not stone. The coast moved every generation, sometimes retreating, sometimes growing. Other civilizations farther inland dismissed the coral as impractical, always rebuilding, always adjusting. But over time, the foamrites realized that this instability was a form of guidance. By observing where sand accumulated and where it washed away, they learned how to shape living foam barriers so that water would slow in some places, accelerate in others, and release sediments where they were needed. Their islands did not resist change, they adapted. In doing so, they created some of the most stable dynamic coastlines of the ancient world. Daily life for the coral foamrites was woven into this rhythm. Their mornings began with listening walks, where small groups moved along the shore collecting fragments of driftwood to reinforce their frameworks. They inspected the texture of the foam, its density, its fragrance, and the way it clung to reeds or stones. All of these details revealed the health of the tides. Midday was for cultivation, stirring pools, brushing algae strains to encourage growth, and guiding threads of living material along rope-like supports. Evenings were for reflection. The setting sun transformed the shallows into glowing bronze, and the coral gathered to share the day's observations in low voices. These gatherings were not debates, they were meditations, gently aligning communal perception. Despite their calm life, the coral achieved a remarkable form of early environmental engineering. Their living barriers reduce storm surge impacts dramatically. They stabilize shorelines in ways that modern scientists now compare to bioshoreline restoration and coastal bioremediation. Their algae mats captured microdebris, purified water, and created nurseries for fish and crustaceans. This produced an abundance that kept their communities nourished even when other island cultures struggled. But the Fomrites never viewed this abundance as wealth. They treated it as a responsibility, believing that any living system that offered protection required reciprocity. Mystery surrounds the coral because they left behind almost no physical artifacts. Organic materials decayed, their driftwood structures dissolved, their algae mats returned to the sea. What remains are faint outlines of terraces, unusual sediment layers, and unfossilized residues showing signs of deliberate cultivation. These traces imply centuries of careful coastal management, but they do not reveal everything. What rituals accompanied the cultivation? How did they discover their techniques? Did they pass on their knowledge to neighboring groups, or did it dissolve with them? The answers slip like water through the fingers of archaeologists. As calm as their lives were, the collapse of the coral Fomrites was gentle too, more of a fading than a fall. The most widely accepted explanation is long-term sea level change. Over generations, rising waters submerged the lowest islands and forced migrations. The coral adapted for a while, shifting their foam structures higher, planting new algae strains in shallower tidal zones, weaving new frameworks farther inland. But eventually the sea rose faster than their systems could adjust. Some communities likely merged with inland cultures, their coastal knowledge absorbed quietly into other traditions. Others may have sailed away, seeking lands where the tides were less restless. But their teachings, being embodied rather than written, dissolved with them. The coral myth of the returning tide might hint at their final era. It describes a time when the ocean breathes inward too deeply, reclaiming its borrowed land. The myth is soft, sorrowful, and accepting. It says that all things built beside water must eventually return to water. This poetic worldview may reflect how they perceived their own disappearance, not as tragedy, but as the continuation of a natural cycle. What remains of the coral Fomrites today are only echoes, gentle patterns in sediment, hints of engineered shorelines, and surprisingly resilient algae strains that seem to have been shaped by centuries of human selection. Modern scientists studying coastal restoration sometimes stumble upon algae that behaves differently from their wild relatives, more durable, more responsive, more collaborative with wave patterns. These living remnants may be the last whispers of the Fomrites' long relationship with the sea. Their story ends not with ruins or monuments, but with a question carried by every tide. How did a people with no metal, writing, and no walls learn to shape the coastline with such quiet mastery? The answer lingers beyond reach, dissolving into the calm rhythm of water meeting sand, exactly as the coral would have wanted.
The Mazarin ledge scribes lived along wind-carved cliffs where the sea rose and fell in slow breaths against stone. Their homes clung to the edges of these precipices, carved carefully into the softer volcanic layers that created natural terraces above the ocean. Their world was not built on wood or clay, but on ledges, narrow shelves of rock exposed to mist, salt, and the rhythmic spray of tides. The Mazarin believed that cliffs were not boundaries, but libraries, each layer of mineral sediment a page, each shift of color a sentence left by time. Their entire civilization formed around the idea that the world wrote constantly and that it was their duty to read it. The Mazarin ledge scribes developed the rare practice of using mineral efflorescence as ink. As salt water evaporated along the cliffs, thin white blooms formed like frost on rock. These blooms carried microscopic traces of seawater chemistry, magnesium, calcium, trace metals, organic residues, seasonal variations in salinity. The Mazarin learned that the patterns changed with storms, rainfall, upwelling currents, and even distant climatic shifts. They found meaning in these patterns long before modern science understood them. What they saw as the breath of the sea is now known in scientific terms as natural seawater chemistry stratification, a real paleoclimate proxy. The Mazarin ledge scribes believed their role was not to write history, but to discover the history the ocean had already written. They etched soft lines over these salt blooms to create layered records, adding shape and guidance to what nature produced. By doing so, they effectively turned cliff faces into chemical archives, where each year added a fresh bloom of data. Their ink was the ocean itself, their parchment was the cliff, their script was a merging of human interpretation and natural deposition. The Mazarin ledge scribes lived in quiet discipline. Their work required early mornings when the cliffs were still cold and the salt efflorescence had grown thick from the night air. They walked the narrow ledges barefoot to maintain balance and sensitivity. The texture of the rock, the thinness of the salt bloom, the faint sheen that formed only during certain tidal phases, these signs mattered to them. Their bodies became instruments of measurement long before instruments existed. Some scribes trained their fingertips to detect slight variations in salt density, something modern scientists measure with specialized sensors. The Mazarin ledge scribes kept no scrolls or books. Their records remained on cliffs. This choice kept their knowledge exposed to the elements, meaning that the cliffs themselves aged, shifted, and eroded. To the Mazarin, this was not a loss. They viewed erosion as a natural revision of history, a reminder that all knowledge is temporary. They believed the ocean should rewrite the past whenever it wished. Their cultural philosophy aligned surprisingly well with modern geological views. The world is not static, it is a continuous record overwritten by natural processes. The Mazarin ledge scribes used specific pigments to stabilize some sections of the cliffs. These pigments were ground from manganese oxides and iron-rich soils, which bonded well with salt crystals. When applied in thin washes, these pigments slowed the dissolution of salt layers, preserving specific segments for decades. In modern chemistry, this resembles the process of mineral stabilization through surface binding, a technique now used in geochemical preservation and paleoclimate studies. The Mazarin ledge scribes maintained an oral tradition that described each cliff as a spine, each ledge as a verse, and each salt ring a breath. Their elders interpreted the cliffs much like dendrochronologists interpret tree rings. A thick salt bloom meant heavy evaporation cycles. A thin bloom indicated cool seasons or storms. When iron traces were present, it suggested distant dust storms from desert winds. When the salt grew unusually translucent, it signaled a period of warm currents bringing different mineral loads. These interpretations were remarkably close to what modern oceanographers now identify using seawater isotopes and chemical analyses. The Mazarin ledge scribes were especially attentive to faint bands of greenish or yellowish tint that appeared some years. These arose from seasonal plankton aerosols carried onto the cliffs by wind and spray. The Mazarin believed these colors represented the sea's memory of life and honored them with special markings. Today, these same deposits can be recognized as microalgal residues, an actual biological signature contained within mineral films. Their cliffs, if ever discovered intact, would serve as an ecological archive spanning centuries. The Mazarin ledge scribes practiced a unique apprenticeship system. Children were taught balance before they were taught reading. They learned to walk the ledges in strong winds, practicing slow breathing to avoid dizziness. The Mazarin believed that only a calm mind could read the patterns of nature without distorting them. Training often began at dawn, when light revealed subtle variations in mineral sheen. The Mazarin considered these early hours sacred, a moment when the world spoke plainly in color and texture. The Mazarin ledge scribes developed a ritual called the quiet turn. Each year, when the salt layers thickened into a fresh seasonal deposit, the oldest scribes led the community along the cliffs. They gently brushed away the previous year's annotations, allowing the new layer to emerge untouched. The act symbolized renewal, acceptance, and the humility to let go of history. Scientifically, this created a sequential annual system, effectively a natural ledger of chemical climate variations, comparable to ice cores or cave speleotums. The Mazarin ledge scribes eventually declined. A series of unusually violent storms eroded their ledges faster than they could maintain them. Many homes and records simply collapsed into the sea. Modern coastal geology confirms that certain cliff zones undergo abrupt instability during episodic climate shifts, particularly when exposed to strong wave action and storm surges. The Mazarin likely witnessed this natural erosion, unable and unwilling to resist the sea's revisions. The Mazarin ledge scribes left no written instructions for their ways. Their final generations are believed to have moved inland, carrying only fragments of pigment bowls and smooth bone styluses used for etching. Their cliffs remained behind. Over centuries, salt blooms continue to form over their markings, blurring the line between what nature wrote and what the Mazarin added. The cliffs became a quiet archive, layered with geochemistry, memory, erosion, and silence. The Mazarin ledge scribes exist now only as a concept, a civilization that treated the earth itself as the author of history. Their legacy is not in surviving texts, but in the idea that the world writes constantly, even when humans do not. Their methods mirror paleoclimate research, environmental chemistry, and the study of mineral deposits as historical proxies. They lived gently, read patiently, and trusted the sea to tell its story in time.
The Coranth Sentinel Forgers emerge in the deep record as a civilization defined by an unusual devotion to structural memory, engineering rituals, and the preservation of long-duration knowledge. Their society appears to have organized itself around the forging of monolithic constructs that encoded astronomical cycles and geological rhythms. Excavated remnants across their region suggest that they developed a symbolic engineering language capable of embedding instructions for future generations within the very materials they shaped. Their constructs were not buildings in a conventional sense, but repositories of encoded insight. When examined through spectral analysis, many surviving fragments show patterned heat stress signatures, almost like a metallurgical script meant to be deciphered only through specific temperature exposures. The Coranth considered matter itself to be a medium of message, treating metal not only as a tool of shaping, but as an instrument of memory. The Coranth Sentinel Forgers developed layered communities structured around guilds, each responsible for mastering a particular material science. The outer guilds handled stone, clay, and sediment analysis, while the inner guilds specialized in heat manipulation, rare mineral extraction, and alloy experimentation. A handful of recovered slag samples reveal an alloy containing traces of vanadium and nickel, suggesting that the Coranth intentionally sought metals that resisted corrosion and thermal degradation. Their walls and monoliths likely lasted far longer than typical ancient structures due to these purposeful compositions. The guild hierarchy also hints at an intellectual system in which deeper knowledge was unlocked only after years of disciplined practice, implying that scientific secrecy may have been culturally enforced. Their guild symbols, etched into fragments of obsidian, appear to show progressive rings signifying stages of metallurgical mastery. The Coranth Sentinel Forgers organized their mythic cycle around the concept of the eternal mechanism, a cosmic structure believed to regulate shifts between seasons of creation and seasons of dissolution. The Coranth saw themselves as caretakers of this mechanism, responsible for maintaining earthly harmony by mirroring celestial balance. Their rituals likely involved monitoring fault line tremors, magnetic anomalies, and cyclical temperature variations, all interpreted as reflections of the mechanism's shifting gears. They did not treat these observations as omens, but as data. Carved stone plates depict circular sequences resembling astronomical diagrams, suggesting that the eternal mechanism may have been an allegory for the interplay between celestial mechanics and geological processes. The Coranth Sentinel Forgers maintained fortified workshops positioned along tectonic boundaries, an unusual decision for an ancient society. Rather than avoiding seismic zones, they embraced them, believing that tectonic rumblings signaled the Earth's internal dialogue. These workshop fortresses were engineered with shock distribution channels that prevented catastrophic collapse. Channels carved into foundation stones redistributed seismic energy across multiple points, anticipating principles later seen in modern base isolation architecture. Some of these features remain intact despite thousands of years of tectonic activity, hinting at a sophisticated understanding of structural stress long before such ideas became formalized sciences. The Corinth Sentinel forgers developed an intricate apprenticeship network. Each novice underwent a multi-stage initiation involving material testing, astronomical observation, and long-duration endurance exercises. Surviving wall etchings show images of apprentices meditating beside cooling furnaces, timing their breaths with metal contraction rates. This fusion of meditative discipline with metallurgical practice suggests that their training methodology was intended to cultivate both cognitive precision and emotional stability. A stable mind in their worldview was as essential as a steady hand. Their apprenticeship rites may have also served to reinforce cultural identity, ensuring that every engineer was not only a technician but a philosophical participant in the eternal mechanism worldview. The Corinth Sentinel forgers appear to have placed great importance on seasonal shifts in magnetic orientation. Layers of sediments near their construction sites contain deposits of aligned iron particles arranged in repeating directional patterns, possibly created intentionally. These deposits might have been used as primitive compasses or calibration patches. Their engineers likely observed anomalies during periods of geomagnetic fluctuation and used these disturbances as reference events to update their long-term orientation models. The presence of these deposits across multiple former workshops implies a standardized system of environmental measurement that spanned their entire civilization. The Corinth Sentinel forgers experienced a decline triggered by a major environmental disturbance. Geological evidence shows a sudden shift in magnetic orientation across their region, likely caused by an unusually strong geomagnetic event or an extended period of atmospheric ionization. This may have disrupted the resonance-based inscriptions within their structures, causing the very data they relied on to lose coherence. Without stable celestial reference points, their dynamic calendar system may have collapsed into confusion. Ritual functions depending on astronomical alignment would have become increasingly inaccurate, leading to cascading failures in the cultural logic that held their guild hierarchy together. As their systems unraveled, workshops appear to have been abandoned systematically, not destroyed. It was a quiet collapse driven by the erosion of predictable stability. The Corinth Sentinel forgers left a legacy of engineered memory and cosmological discipline. Their surviving constructs remind us that ancient societies often blended myth with scientific inquiry in ways that feel surprisingly modern. The Corinth pursued not just the forging of metal, but the forging of meaning, attempting to stabilize the world through precision, predictability, and a profound respect for the long rhythms of the cosmos. Their story, fragmentary yet resonant, reveals a civilization that saw no boundary between spiritual duty and material science. The Corinth Sentinel forgers continue to influence modern researchers who study ancient engineering. Their designs inspire speculation on lost methods of environmental sensing and structural encoding. Some researchers believe the Corinth may have used heated stone plates to store periodic signals from the Earth's magnetic field, functioning like analog data logs. Others propose that their workshops served as long-term environmental observatories, monitoring Earth's slow transformations across centuries. Their complexity challenges assumptions about the technological limits of pre-literate societies. The Corinth Sentinel forgers thus stand as a testament to humanity's enduring desire to translate the shifting patterns of nature into stable forms of understanding. Though much about them remains mysterious, each recovered fragment adds to a picture of a civilization deeply attuned to Earth's inner rhythms. Their work endures not only through the surviving artifacts, but through the modern curiosity they continue to spark. a reminder that ancient knowledge often lies waiting in the quiet weight of stone and metal, encoded by hands that believed the world itself was a mechanism worth tending.
The aerolith cloud chroniclers emerge in the archaeological and atmospheric record as a civilization uniquely devoted to the systematic observation of sky patterns, high-altitude phenomena, and long-duration climate cycles. Their settlements were built on elevated plateaus specifically chosen for uninterrupted horizon visibility, and many of their surviving artifacts indicate an obsession with the shifting architecture of clouds. They treated the sky not as a backdrop, but as a living archive of the planet's behavior. Their name, derived from inscriptions found on weathered quartz tablets, emphasizes their identity as chroniclers, recorders of atmospheric memory. Their belief appeared to have believed that the past, present, and future of their world could be read in vapor trails, stratified clouds, and the subtle shifts in seasonal wind geometry. The aerolith cloud chroniclers constructed elaborate sky indexing stations. These stations were circular terraces engraved with radiating lines that aligned with known wind corridors. Embedded in the terraces were rows of highly polished stone discs, each capable of reflecting specific cloud formations at particular angles. This arrangement allowed observers to measure altitude, density, and directional change without relying on written numeration. Instead, their recordings were encoded through the angle of reflection and the alignment of terrace markers. Some terraces contained shallow basins of reflective liquid, likely a mixture of water and a mineral-based clarifier, that produced mirror-like surfaces used to observe vertical cloud stacks. The sophistication of these constructs suggests an early form of atmospheric tomography, far more advanced than typical ancient observational methods. The aerolith cloud chroniclers integrated climate study deeply into their social structure. Families inherited specific sky corridors to observe, and each lineage became responsible for a particular segment of the horizon. This distributed observational network functioned as a communal climate archive. When combined, their recordings created a comprehensive atmospheric timeline spanning decades or even centuries. It appears that the aerolith believed civilization survived only when they aligned their routines with the rhythms of the sky, and any disruption of this alignment risked societal imbalance. Their collective memory was therefore atmospheric rather than literary, a multi-generational cloud archive encoded not on paper but in practice. The aerolith cloud chroniclers possessed an unusual sensitivity to upper atmospheric anomalies. Mineralogical analysis of pigments found at former settlements indicates that they used iron-rich ochre to paint diagrams of lenticular clouds, mammatus clusters, and rare polar stratospheric structures. Each formation corresponded to a symbolic meaning. Mammatus bulges, for instance, were associated with periods of climatic instability, while elongated cirrus threads signified seasons of calm abundance. These meanings were not mystical, but derived from long-term empirical correlations. Their sky lexicon likely represented centuries of compiled environmental data, giving them an intuitive predictive model for weather fluctuations and regional climate shifts. The aerolith cloud chroniclers engineered lightweight wind instruments from hollowed reeds and thin sheets of pliable stone. These instruments generated subtle tonal variations depending on humidity, wind velocity, and temperature. Positioned across their settlements, they allowed residents to perceive atmospheric changes through sound. Higher-pitched tones indicated incoming dry fronts, while deeper resonances signaled moisture-bearing winds. Some instruments produced harmonic oscillations that corresponded to approaching storms. The aerolith appeared to have created a sonic weather map, an early auditory meteorological system. Their cultural rituals likely incorporated these tones, transforming climate observation into communal events. The aerolith cloud chroniclers tracked high-altitude luminous events with exceptional precision. Carved panels discovered near their plateaus depict auroral sheets, faint noctilucent clouds, and possible depictions of rare upper atmospheric plasma formations.
Their fascination with such events may have stemmed from the belief that the sky occasionally revealed its inner wiring, offering glimpses of cosmic or atmospheric restructuring. This belief was not mystical fatalism, but a conceptual framework for understanding irregular atmospheric phenomena. They likely noticed correlations between solar activity, auroral patterns, and weather variability, forming an intuitive early model of solar-terrestrial interaction. The aerolith cloud chroniclers implemented a unique agricultural system dependent on atmospheric rhythms rather than soil cycles. Seeds were planted only after a specific sequence of cloud formations appeared in the sky, a sequence that likely indicated a shift in humidity patterns favorable for germination. This timing mechanism helped them avoid failed harvests due to unpredictable rainfall. Botanists studying aerolith residue samples found pollen from moisture-sensitive crops organized in distinct layers that correspond to recorded cloud cycles. Their agricultural approach essentially transformed atmospheric interpretation into a biological survival strategy, demonstrating a level of environmental attunement rarely seen in early civilizations. The aerolith cloud chroniclers communicated time through sky color, not through numerical calendars. They used a sophisticated color taxonomic system to classify dawn and dusk gradients, with each hue representing a specific segment of the seasonal cycle. Surviving pigments, from deep cobalt to pale rose quartz, match the tones commonly seen during temperature inversions or transitional weather periods. Their chronological system may have allowed them to identify long-term climate shifts by tracking subtle deviations in seasonal sky colours. This method, though visually driven, was likely far more dynamic than fixed calendars, adapting continuously to environmental change. The aerolith cloud chroniclers eventually faced decline due to a prolonged period of atmospheric unpredictability. Sediment cores extracted near their settlements show increased volcanic ash distribution during the era of their disappearance. Persistent ash layers would have obscured cloud structures, rendering their entire observational system ineffective. With their atmospheric archive erased by opacity in the sky, the Aero lost the foundation of their predictive models and agricultural timing. Evidence suggests they attempted to adapt by constructing additional reflective basins and elevating watch platforms. But these efforts could not compensate for long-term atmospheric dimming. Their civilization appears to have dispersed gradually, each family line abandoning its sky corridor as the clouds they depended on became unreadable. The aerolith cloud chroniclers nonetheless left an intellectual legacy rooted in atmospheric awareness. Their contributions offer insight into an early framework of climatology, showing that ancient societies could achieve remarkable observational depth without modern tools. Their practice of integrating long-term environmental study into everyday life suggests an understanding of climate continuity that modern observers often overlook. Though much about their practices remains speculative, the fragments that survive reveal a people who saw patterns where others saw emptiness, reading the sky as an evolving manuscript of the planet's state. The aerolith cloud chroniclers stand as a reminder that civilizations can derive stability not only from engineering or agriculture, but from observation, the disciplined habit of looking upward day after day, generation after generation. Their devotion transformed the sky into a repository of memory and foresight, demonstrating that knowledge grounded in patience can become a culture's most enduring asset. Even as their world darkened under atmospheric disruption, the remnants of their sky lexicon endure, whispering the quiet precision with which they once studied the shifting architecture of clouds. The Thalor deep-root navigators existed along submerged continental ledges where land met steep ocean drop-offs, positioning themselves at the boundary between stable coastal life and the unpredictable depths. Their name was recovered from carved driftstone tablets etched with spiraling root-like patterns, a symbol that represented both literal plant roots and the routes they followed across the seafloor. They were one of the few ancient cultures whose engineering, navigation, and spiritual identity were built entirely around the structure and behavior of underwater root networks.
massive, interwoven mats of mangrove-like organisms that existed thousands of years before similar ecosystems formed in the modern world. These organisms anchored sediment, shaped currents, redirected tidal flows, and created natural pathways along the seabed. To the Thalor, these root systems were not just plants, they were ancient guides. The Thalor deep root navigators began their settlements on elevated rock shelves that overlooked shallow inlets filled with sprawling subaquatic root forests. These forests consisted of thick wooden tendrils extending several meters downward, forming labyrinthine corridors that stabilized marine ecosystems. The Thalor believed these roots were remnants of an earlier world, a biological inheritance from a civilization older than theirs. Their earliest dwellings incorporated the roots themselves, weaving them into walls and floors that expanded naturally as the plants grew. Archaeological analysis of preserved wooden fragments shows clean, deliberate shaping marks, suggesting they selectively trammed and encouraged root growth to form naturally curved structures resistant to storms and erosion. The Thalor deep root navigators developed a unique form of underwater navigation based on the tactile reading of root patterns. Their divers wore lightweight woven suits made from flexible kelp fibers that allowed them to feel subtle shifts in current as they swam through root tunnels. They memorized the pressure signatures of each corridor. Some tunnels guided divers toward nutrient-rich fisheries, others opened into deep caverns or thermally active vent systems. The Thalor mapped these underwater pathways entirely through touch and breath pacing, storing the maps as rhythmic sequences, long patterns of inhalation, fin strokes, and directional taps on their chests. These breathing maps were passed down through families like oral histories, and losing one's personal map was considered a catastrophic memory loss, equivalent to losing a family lineage. The Thalor deep root navigators integrated bioluminescent organisms into their exploration routines. They cultivated colonies of small luminescent crustaceans inside hollow seed pods tied to their wrists and ankles. When moved in specific patterns, the pods emitted steady pulses of blue or green light, illuminating root corridors without startling marine life. The placement of pods also helped divers maintain orientation in the twisting underwater forest. Chemical analysis of residue found in ancient pods indicates they sustained two distinct bioluminescent species simultaneously, one that responded to water movement and another that glowed brightest when exposed to thermal gradients. This suggests the Thalor used their pod lights as a combined compass and thermometer. The Thalor deep root navigators also constructed large surface platforms anchored with weighted root bundles. These platforms acted as floating archives. Each contained layers of carved panels arranged in expanding circles. The outermost rings described current root corridor conditions, while the inner rings contained older data, stories, and observations. Some panels recorded seasonal changes in root density, storm damage, or the appearance of unusual marine creatures. The meticulous organization implies a culture obsessed with long-term oceanic cycles. Researchers believe these platforms drifted slowly along predetermined currents, functioning as both communal gathering places and mobile data libraries. The Thalor deep root navigators maintained an extraordinary relationship with large benthic animals. Evidence suggests they domesticated a species of broad-finned ray distinguished by unusual cranial ridges. Fossil impressions show these ridges were sensitive to low-frequency vibrations, allowing the rays to detect tremors traveling through the root networks. The Thalor used these animals as natural seafloor sentinels. When distant disturbances occurred, landslides, volcanic murmurs, or migrating deep-sea predators, the rays would shift their swimming patterns, alerting nearby Thalor communities. These creatures were not used for riding or labor. Instead, they served as early warning systems and companions. The Thalor deep root navigators held a deeply philosophical view of the ocean floor. They believed the seabed formed a memory lattice, capturing the echoes of geological events. The roots in their worldview acted as translators of those memories. As the roots swayed, cracked, and regrew, they encoded shifting patterns of the ocean's past.
Reading the roots meant reading time itself. This belief gave rise to the silent descent rites, a tradition in which trained divers descended alone into the deepest accessible tunnels, reading the oldest, thickest roots to interpret the direction of their civilization's future. Although modern researchers cannot confirm their interpretations, layers of sediment around these tunnels show periods of careful maintenance and use lasting centuries. The Thalor deep root navigators operated a unique burial practice tied directly to the root forests. Instead of interring bodies in soil or water, they placed woven sarcophagi in specific nodes of the root networks, allowing the roots to gradually engulf and fuse with the remains. These fusion sites grew into bulbous knots that contained mineral deposits not found in natural roots. Some knots showed film-like shells of hardened calcium carbonate infused with trace metals. This indicates an unexpected biological transformation, possibly accelerated by the microbial colonies present in the root systems. For the Thalor, these burial knots were not graves, they were lineage markers that harmonized their dead with the underwater pathways they navigated. The Thalor deep root navigators eventually faced a dramatic collapse. Sediment records and underwater rock cores reveal a sequence of rapid geologic shifts along continental shelves where they lived. A chain of underwater landslides triggered disruptions in the root forests, uprooting or burying entire sections. The once stable root networks became fractured, severing major corridors the Thalor depended on. Their navigation systems, food sources, burial sites, and structural foundations all deteriorated within a few generations. The rays they relied on would have sensed the instability first. Fossil distributions suggest mass migrations away from the area before the final collapse. The Thalor attempted to rebuild, but without coherent root systems, their entire cultural infrastructure unraveled. The Thalor deep root navigators left behind a legacy rooted in ecological attunement. Their civilization demonstrated that profound knowledge can be gained through tactile experience, patient observation, and long-term interaction with natural systems. They lived not above the environment, but woven into it, moving through underwater corridors shaped by the planet's oldest biological engineers. Their downfall serves as a reminder that civilizations built on natural stability are vulnerable when foundational ecosystems deteriorate. Yet the precision and sensitivity of their methods reveal a sophisticated understanding of submarine environments long before such spaces were charted by modern science. The Thalor deep root navigators remain an example of a culture that created maps without ink, archives without books, and pathways without roads. Their memory persists in fragmented root knots, driftstone carvings, and the quiet echoes of a civilization that once navigated the deep not with compasses, but with trust in the ancient architecture beneath the waves.
The Island Drift Map Guild emerged along a stretch of coast where the water always seemed to carry more stories than waves, where every incoming tide delivered fragments of distant worlds. Their earliest villages rested on narrow spits of sand braided with kelp, each house built lightly as if the people understood from the beginning that permanence was an illusion in a place shaped by the ocean's endless breathing. Their identity formed around this drifting landscape, and in time they became known not for their settlements but for their ability to read the sea itself. The guild grew from a quiet recognition shared among a few families, that the smallest pieces of the ocean's wandering debris could whisper patterns no horizon could reveal directly. Without announcing themselves as a scholarly order or a navigational sect, they slowly became the keepers of an observational science carried entirely in the mind and in memory, refined by watching what others ignored. They studied strands of kelp that washed ashore after storms, noticing subtle variations in thickness, pigmentation, and the organisms clinging to them. Each difference marked a distinct region of the sea, and by arranging these pieces in careful sequences, they mapped the wandering of surface currents with an accuracy that later mariners would struggle to replicate even with instruments. Small creatures tangled within flotsam, snail larvae, translucent salps, drifting polyps became biological markers.
Their presence or absence described gyres, eddies, temperature shifts, and seasonal plankton blooms. Every object held meaning. Driftwood polished to different degrees revealed the intensity of currents. Pumice grain sizes suggested volcanic activity far away. Feathers from pelagic birds carried migration clues. They observed all of this in silence, committing thousands of permutations to communal memory. Their guild houses were simple shelters woven from reeds, their roofs sloping low so that wind glided over them without sound. Inside, elders taught apprentices using long troughs filled with water, where they recreated miniature currents by directing slow streams through narrow channels. Into these they dropped fragments of seaweed, seeds, and small carved chips, watching how each responded. These experiments were not playful demonstrations, but precise analogs of the greater ocean, scaled down but faithful in principle. The Island believed that any flow, whether in a bowl, a tide pool, or a vast sea, adhered to the same underlying behaviors, and learning the small revealed the nature of the large. Their practice resembled early hydrodynamic modeling long before such a concept would gain scholarly recognition elsewhere. One of the deepest mysteries surrounding them was their extraordinary ability to forecast the arrival of drift long before it touched shore. They could stand at the edge of the water, their eyes fixed not on the surface, but on the texture of foam, on the faint swirling of suspended silt, on how a single line of bubbles curved around an unseen pole. To them, it was a quiet language the sea spoke constantly. Through these cues, they predicted when new materials, kelp from distant beds, resin lumps from far-off forests, shells of species not local to their region, would arrive. They used this foresight not for trade or power, but to maintain a rhythm of observation, so that they were ready to interpret each piece the moment it appeared. Their daily life was unhurried, shaped by the slow tempo of tides. The people rose with the faint gray before dawn and walked the beaches barefoot, sensing variations in temperature and texture beneath their feet. Morning tasks involved gathering all new drift, sorting it into categories along long, shallow trays carved from softwood. Children participated from a young age, their natural curiosity nurtured into quiet attentiveness. Midday was reserved for discussion, though discussion among the Island was not performed with many words. A few elders would point to arrays of materials and let the younger members form interpretations, offering correction only through gentle gestures. Meals were simple: fish dried on salt beds, marsh herbs, and a fermented drink made from sea greens grown in sheltered pools. Even eating felt like part of their observational discipline. They valued foods that allowed clarity of thought rather than heaviness. They navigated the open water using boats narrower than typical coastal vessels. Each craft had a long fin beneath the hull, a kind of submerged sail that caught the subtle undercurrents beneath the surface chop. By adjusting the fin's angle with cords and shifting their own weight, the mariners rode currents invisible to the eye. Because they relied more on these subsurface flows than on wind, their voyages were extraordinarily quiet. Traveling in this manner demanded a profound understanding of how water layers interact, knowledge they derived from decades of drift analysis. Their routes traced the hidden skeleton of the sea, moving not in straight lines, but in gentle arcs that followed forces other cultures never realized existed. Yet, despite their mastery, the Island never sought expansion. They saw their discoveries not as tools for conquest, but as conversations with the ocean, dialogues that required humility. They were careful not to overload their boats with materials, believing that taking too much disrupted the balance they depended upon. They fished lightly, cultivated only what they needed, and refrained from altering currents or shorelines. Even their shelters were designed to be reclaimed by the sea when abandoned. This gentle philosophy permeated everything they built. No one knows why the guild dissolved. There are only quiet suggestions carried through later oral histories. A slow shift in the alignment of currents that moved the drift lines away from their shores. A period of prolonged storm activity that erased their low-built homes. Or perhaps a gradual dispersal of the people as younger members followed the flows they once studied, drifting into other lands and other identities. The disappearance seems to echo their own understanding of impermanence. Their coastal settlements may simply have yielded to rising tides, their reed roofs pulled away by wind, their drift trays washed out to sea. Whatever the cause, their story fades without abruptness, more a gentle receding than an end. What remains of them is the lingering idea that knowledge can be carried in the smallest fragments, that understanding vast systems does not require massive structures or grand declarations, only patience and willingness to observe. And as the mind drifts through their memory, it becomes easy to imagine those long stretches of shoreline where they walked at dawn, reading the sea the way others read written pages, tracing invisible currents with the softness of breath and the steadiness of tide. The Haraun ember weavers left behind one of the most unusual material traditions in coastal history, a culture whose identity revolved around the controlled transformation of volcanic glass. Their settlements were located along shorelines where basaltic flows once met seawater, producing natural shards of obsidian and pumice-like composites scattered across the beaches. The Haraun discovered early that heating obsidian in carefully regulated temperatures altered its brittleness and acoustic qualities. This discovery, initially accidental, evolved into a refined craft that defined their social structure, trade relations, and ceremonial practices. The ember weavers recognized that not all volcanic glass behaved the same. The silica content, cooling rate, and trapped mineral inclusions determined how the material responded to heat. Their approach resembled a proto-industrial method more than a primitive craft. They constructed shallow sand furnaces lined with heat-resistant stones, channeling coastal winds using curved driftwood vents. Some furnaces use tidal inlets to achieve gradual cooling, allowing the glass to anneal without shattering. Their earliest tools were thin plates shaped into broad paddle-like forms. Through experimentation, the Haraun learned that particular plate shapes produced low-frequency hums when struck or exposed to wind. This sound phenomenon guided them toward more complex resonant structures. Over centuries, the culture transitioned from purely functional manufacture toward the production of instruments capable of emitting sustained infrasonic tones. These tones traveled remarkably far in the quiet night air of their small islands. The low frequencies were used not as music, but as communicative signals. Villages across the cliffs and coves would exchange slow, deliberate pulses to indicate weather changes, incoming tides, or the return of fishing expeditions. Archaeologists studying the remnants of Haraun chambers found basalt corridors shaped to guide these vibrations, similar to how modern acoustic engineers tune architectural spaces. Geographically, their homeland consisted of rugged coastal shelves cut by ancient lava flows. These surfaces created natural amphitheaters and wind channels ideal for acoustic experimentation. Many of their ceremonial buildings were carved into cliffs where the natural rock density enhanced sound transmission. Some chambers show signs of intentional shaping to reflect and reinforce specific wavelengths. The entrances were narrow but opened into rounded cavities, carefully tuned to create standing waves. These designs suggest a sophisticated empirical understanding of natural resonance patterns. The Haraun were not a large civilization, but their influence extended widely through trade networks. They exchanged resonant plates, polished glass shards, and obsidian tools with nearby islanders. In return, they acquired rare tree resins, dyes, and dried plants that fueled their furnaces or served in binding agents for composite instruments. Their mastery of volcanic glass also led them into early geological study. The Haraun classified obsidian by color, grain, and origin, noting which types fractured cleanly and which emitted clearer tones. Certain deposits were reserved for ritual purposes because they produced long, pure vibrations. Others were used for daily tools or traded outward. This selective sourcing created a geographic mapping system where different glass categories corresponded to specific cliffs, beaches, or inland vents. Their oral histories refer to these places with names describing sound quality rather than landscape features. Some cliffs were known as the Soft Hum Ridge, while others carried terms equivalent to Hard Echo Spire. These poetic labels doubled as practical markers for resource harvesting. Their population structure centered around guilds. The Ember Weaver guilds were organized into age-based tiers. Younger members gathered raw materials and tended the furnaces. Mid-level artisans shaped plates, tested frequencies, and recorded results in mnemonic chants. Elder weavers, the highest tier, oversaw resonance chambers and maintained the long-range communication system that linked coastal settlements. The weavers also trained apprentices orally, passing down tactile knowledge through demonstrations instead of written records. This method was precise and deeply embodied, requiring students to sense subtle temperature changes, microfractures, and sound vibrations. Their coastline was prone to periodic volcanic activity. Rather than fear these eruptions, the Haroun interpreted them as renewals of their material lifeline. Fresh obsidian flows meant new potential tones. Over generations, the guilds maintained detailed memory lines describing which eruptions produced the most reliable material. These memory lines were recited during annual gatherings around the furnace sites. In addition to communication, the Ember Weavers used their resonant plates to monitor natural events. Some plates responded to shifts in humidity or approaching storms by producing faint tremors. Such sensitivity enabled them to predict weather patterns with surprising accuracy. They placed certain plates near cliffs where sea winds intensified before seasonal changes. When the plates hummed irregularly, the villagers prepared for storms or altered fishing schedules. This natural meteorological practice made them resilient in an unpredictable environment. Their engineering extended to maritime structures as well. The Ember Weavers embedded tuned glass fragments into wooden docks, allowing them to detect subtle shifts in wave patterns by interpreting vibrations transmitted through the wood. This early wave sensing system functioned as a primitive oceanic monitoring network. Their boats also carried glass strips fixed beneath the hull. When water conditions changed, these strips vibrated, providing cues for navigating shallow waters, reefs, or approaching turbulence. Culturally, sound shaped their spiritual identity. They believed each person carried an inner resonance, a frequency that matched a specific type of volcanic glass. During rites of passage, Ember Weavers tested youths with dozens of small glass plates. The plate that produced the clearest tone when placed near the youth's chest became a symbolic representation of their personal resonance. The chosen plate was later incorporated into their tools, garments, or ceremonial items. This belief tied individual identity to material acoustics. Their decline appears connected to geological change. Over time, the volcanic vents that supplied the highest quality glass became inactive. Without fresh material, the culture struggled to maintain its craft. Additionally, rising sea levels submerged some of their key furnace sites. The resonance chambers, once tuned precisely, lost their acoustic properties as water seeped in or cliff faces collapsed. Some groups migrated inland, but the craft depended heavily on coastal wind channels. Eventually, the guild system fragmented, and the knowledge passed into scattered lineages who kept small aspects of the tradition alive but did not preserve the full craft. Today, remnants of Haroun influence appear in unrelated coastal cultures that still use low-frequency conch shell signals or wind stone instruments. Though these practices evolved independently, they echo the Ember Weaver's central insight that landscape, wind, and material can form a slow, enduring language across distance.
The Kilari saltbinders developed their society around landscapes shaped by intense evaporation, where wide salt flats extended across shallow basins fed by seasonal tides. Their agricultural practices and cultural identity formed a single integrated system. They grew halophyte crops using controlled saline irrigation while also crystallizing their communal records into blocks of compressed salt. The combined engineering, agriculture, and data preservation methods created a unique civilization defined by the management of mineral water cycles.
Their settlements occupied regions where coastal winds regularly swept across dry basins, leaving deposits of salt minerals that thickened over generations. The Kilauea recognized patterns in how these deposits formed and used those patterns to determine planting cycles, water channels, and harvesting periods. The foundation of their agricultural technique lay in the use of halophytes, plants that thrive in highly saline environments. The Kilauea cultivated species analogous to modern glassworts, saltbushes, and sea purslane. These plants not only provided food, but also generated biomass that could be burned as fuel for evaporative chambers. The Kilauea engineered irrigation routes by digging shallow channels that allowed seawater to flow into their fields during high tide. As the water receded and evaporation accelerated under strong sunlight, salt concentrations rose. They monitored the salinity carefully, using reed floats and mineral flakes that changed color based on the concentration. When the levels reached the precise range that halophytes preferred, they diverted the remaining water into secondary flats designed for salt crystallization. Their economy relied heavily on the production of salt bricks. These were not simple mineral blocks. They were encoded with patterns representing communal knowledge. Within these bricks, the Kilauea embedded fibrous plant threads, tinted by crushed minerals, and arranged in sequences representing historical events, harvest yields, or tidal observations. Once packed into crystalline layers, the bricks acted like durable tablets. They were stacked in specialized archives, long, narrow halls with minimal humidity, where they could survive for decades or even centuries. The data encoding system resembled a cross between mnemonic textiles and geological sampling. When a brick needed to be read, the community elders soaked it lightly to expose embedded patterns. The colors and thread positions corresponded to structured memory lines, which the elders recited aloud. Their geographic location shaped their culture. The salt flats provided both abundance and danger. Floods could dissolve entire archives. Storm surges could bury crops under sediment. To manage these risks, the Kilauea observed atmospheric conditions with great attention. They mounted polished salt mirrors at the edges of their fields to assess humidity through changes in reflectivity. They also built tall wooden poles with mineral-coated surfaces that reacted to wind-driven moisture. When a storm approached, the salts would begin to clump or streak, providing early warning. Their architecture adapted to these environmental realities. Houses were raised on platforms made of compressed salt-enriched clay reinforced with halophyte fibers. Roofs were wide and angled to prevent dissolution during storms. Storage halls, where salt bricks were kept, were coated with hydrophobic plant resins to reduce moisture intrusion. The Kilauea viewed salt not only as a resource but as a symbolic representation of continuity. They believed that knowledge preserved in mineral form gained stability, just as salt itself resists decay. Rituals involved slowly dissolving old bricks to retire outdated information, allowing it to return to the basin and recrystallize naturally. This practice created a physical cycle of memory. Information dissolved, mixed with new deposits, and solidified again. Their culture, therefore, tied the passage of time to mineral transformation. Trade played a significant role in their survival. Salt from their flats was exceptionally pure, making it valuable to neighboring island groups. In exchange, the Kilauea obtained hardwoods, fish oil, ceramic vessels, and rare pigments used to dye the threads within memory bricks. Their salt bricks also served as diplomatic tokens. Encoded bricks were exchanged between neighboring communities as a gesture of trust. Receiving a brick meant receiving a portion of the giver's recorded history. Their water management system showed remarkable sophistication. Instead of relying on open reservoirs, they constructed condensation galleries, subterranean corridors lined with porous stones. The temperature difference between these galleries and the hot air above caused water vapor to condense on the stone surfaces, allowing them to collect fresh water without relying solely on rainfall. This fresh water was then used to rinse halophyte seeds or prepare mineral dyes. The galleries also provided a cool environment for preserving perishable goods. Much of the Kilaue's daily life revolved around the rhythm of the tides. Children were taught to read the subtle patterns in the flats, how the surface crust grew thicker after high evaporation days, how small ripples signaled underground moisture channels, and how the color of salt changed as different minerals precipitated. Their linguistic system incorporated hundreds of terms for variations in salt texture, grain size, and sheen, revealing how deeply intertwined their identity was with this environment. Their decline can be traced to climatic shifts and geological changes. Over several centuries, sea levels fluctuated unpredictably, creating periods when the flats were either too flooded or too dry for stable crop growth. Prolonged droughts led to excessively hard salt surfaces that prevented proper irrigation. Meanwhile, increased storm frequency destroyed portions of their archives, erasing generations of encoded knowledge. As memory bricks dissolved unintentionally during floods, the elders could no longer maintain complete historical continuity. The culture survived for a while by migrating inland, but without reliable evaporation basins, their agricultural system collapsed. The last Kilauea groups dispersed, and their traditions faded into other island cultures. Modern researchers studying remnants of Kilauea salt terraces have found crystallization layers that correspond to regional climate fluctuations, indicating their knowledge system also preserved environmental data. Thin inclusions of dyed fiber still remain trapped in ancient salt columns, demonstrating how effectively their encoded records blended human history with mineral processes. Their civilization demonstrates a rare synthesis of agriculture, geology, and information storage, showing how a society can transform a challenging environment into a long-lasting archive.
The Nereis cloud quilters lived on steep mountain islands where humid marine winds rose sharply along cliff faces, creating constant sheets of drifting fog. Their entire civilization formed around harnessing this fog as a primary water source. They developed a complex textile tradition, not for clothing alone, but for atmospheric engineering. The Nereis wove immense vertical panels designed to capture tiny droplets suspended in the mist. These panels were stretched across wooden frames, positioned along ridge lines where the fog was densest. Through generations of refinement, they learned how different fiber structures altered condensation efficiency, enabling them to harvest water even during seasons when rainfall ceased. Their society depended on this delicate and highly specialized craft, which allowed them to thrive in terrain otherwise too dry and steep for reliable fresh water accumulation. Their fibers came from mountain shrubs that had evolved waxy coatings. By stripping the outer bark and soaking the strands in mineral-rich pools, the Nereis achieved a microtexture that encouraged droplets to nucleate and slide down into collection channels. These channels carried water to cisterns carved directly into the cliffs. The cisterns formed the core of every settlement. Families were responsible for maintaining specific sections of the fog nets, and skill in creating high-yield textile panels was considered a mark of prestige. Over time, their weavers discovered that alternating coarse and fine threads increased both surface area and airflow resistance, enhancing moisture capture. The panels were replaced seasonally because they slowly stiffened with mineral deposition. The Nereis mapped their environment with precision. They charted wind corridors that carried the densest fog, and they measured the shifting patterns caused by seasonal temperature differences. Their knowledge of atmospheric behavior parallels modern fog harvesting research. They built tall observation spires on the mountain's western faces to track the earliest arrival of dawn fogs by watching how light scattered across drifting particles. They taught children to recognize the subtle differences between thick roll fog, which brought heavy moisture, and thin lace fog, which indicated low yield. These categories formed part of their vocabulary for planning daily work and adjusting textile tension. Their settlements hugged the mountainsides in terraced layouts. Houses built from stone and wood were arranged in long arcs facing the prevailing winds, ensuring maximum fog interception. Roofs were steep and narrow to reduce drag and avoid disrupting airflow toward the textile panels. Beneath each home, a small system of channels directed captured water into domestic storage jars. The community shared large cisterns for agriculture. Their terrace farms contained crops adapted to cool, moist conditions. Root vegetables, leafy greens, and hardy grains formed the basis of their diet. They also cultivated medicinal plants that thrived in the constant humidity provided by the drifting fog. The Neris did not rely solely on fog capture. They constructed reflective rock gardens that helped direct cold air across the mountainside at night. This temperature gradient encouraged condensation on stone surfaces, adding supplemental moisture to their collection system. During periods of warmer climate cycles, when fog layers thinned, they relied more heavily on these nighttime dew traps. The rock gardens were arranged with mathematical precision, showing an advanced understanding of heat transfer long before such principles were formalized. Their use of thermally radiative cooling surfaces effectively mirrored modern passive water collection methods. Much of their culture centered on the metaphoric idea of quilting the sky. They believed the fog carried memories of the ocean, and that by weaving textiles to catch it, they were stitching together fragments of distant winds. Their artistic motifs included spirals representing rising air currents and elongated diamond patterns symbolizing droplets merging. Ceremonies were held during the installation of new fog nets. At these gatherings, elders recited records embedded in cloth scrolls, recounting years of droughts, abundant fog seasons, and shifts in wind direction. These scrolls served as historical climatology archives. Their understanding of moisture cycles was remarkably accurate. The Neris noted that certain years produced condensed droplets with a slightly different mineral taste. By analyzing these subtle changes, they identified long-term variations in atmospheric composition. They associated some shifts with volcanic activity on distant islands, having observed that ash particles increase the density of fog. Their interpretations reveal an early form of atmospheric chemistry observation through direct sensory analysis. Over centuries, they created a body of knowledge describing the interplay between sea temperature, wind patterns, and fog formation. At the heart of their technological advancement was the loom ridge, a long platform where master weavers crafted large cloud-catching panels. Weaving required not only technical skill, but also a deep understanding of airflow dynamics. The angle of thread intersections was adjusted based on predicted fog thickness for the upcoming season. They used simple wooden gauges to measure tension precisely. Their weaving tools were lightweight, allowing them to work efficiently despite the constant mountain winds. Apprentices trained for years before they were allowed to weave on the main ridge, as mistakes could reduce water yield for the entire community. Trade existed but was limited by geography. Caravans from lower islands climbed steep paths to exchange dried fish, obsidian tools, and coastal herbs for Neris textiles. These textiles were prized because they resisted moisture damage and insulated well in cold weather. Some neighboring cultures also sought their knowledge of fog harvesting. The Neris taught only partial methods, preserving their most advanced techniques within their own lineage. Their isolation, however, meant that when climatic conditions shifted, they lacked external support systems. Over time, prolonged changes in wind direction reduced fog density along their mountain ridges. The decline of the Neris cloud quilters began gradually. Shifts in sea temperature altered atmospheric circulation patterns, causing fog bands to move away from their island. They attempted to adapt by relocating some fog nets to lower elevations, but the moisture levels remained insufficient. Storms also increased in intensity, destroying the delicate textile fields and damaging cisterns. Without enough water to sustain agriculture, crops failed. Some communities migrated downslope and mixed with coastal cultures, bringing fragments of their textile knowledge. Others remained until dwindling water supplies forced abandonment.
Evidence of their terraces, cisterns, and loam ridges still persist in eroded forms, showing how closely their survival depended on atmospheric cycles. Modern analysis of surviving textile fragments reveals microstructures optimized for maximizing water collection, comparable to certain contemporary fog harvesting meshes. Mineral deposits on ancient loam stones reveal long-term moisture patterns and suggest a history of climatic fluctuations that aligns with broader regional paleoclimate records. The Nares cloud quilters exemplify a civilization that mastered the art of extracting life from the sky through ingenuity, observation, and delicate engineering.
The Bale shoreglass archivists lived along long crescent beaches where tides shifted slowly enough to expose broad stretches of sand perfect for their resin casting techniques. Their civilization formed around the practice of embedding biological and mineral fragments into layers of translucent shoreline resin, creating multi-century environmental archives. The Bale viewed their coastline not only as a home, but as a living library where every tide delivered new data. Their craft involved heating natural resins derived from coastal shrubs, blending them with fine sand, then layering microshells, phytoliths, and pollen grains between thin sheets. These layered glass-like slabs were stored in long, low vaults carved into the dunes. Over generations, these archives became a continuous ecological record capturing bloom cycles, storm events, and species changes. The Bale shoreglass archivists honed their technique through careful control of temperature and timing. They harvested resin from the bark of hardy shoreline plants and mixed it with powdered silica collected from wind-shaped dunes. This mixture, when heated in shallow solar troughs, produced a clear, stable material similar to primitive glass polymer composites. The Bale heated these mixtures using reflectors made from polished shells, aligning them with the path of the afternoon sun. Once the resin melted, they poured it into long rectangular molds formed from driftwood frames. Into each layer, they gently pressed samples collected from tide pools, beach wrack, and dune grasses. Over time, these slabs recorded the rise and fall of microscopic life, making each one a snapshot of the ecosystem. The Bale shoreglass archivists treated their slabs as both scientific tools and cultural heirlooms. Their vaults were arranged chronologically, each row representing a century, each slab filled with environmental indicators. The archivists studied the patterns preserved within the resin: pollen variations revealing shifts in plant communities, shell fragments indicating water temperature changes, and silt layers pointing to storm surges. These observations help them predict future environmental conditions, allowing the Bale to adapt their fishing, farming, and building strategies. For them, reading a slab was a quiet ritual. Elders would trace patterns with their fingertips, interpreting subtle differences in coloration and texture. Their understanding of long-term ecological patterns was deeply advanced, mirroring what modern scientists achieve through sediment cores and microfossil analysis. The Bale shoreglass archivists built their settlements around natural depressions where dunes created sheltered pockets. Homes were constructed from clay, driftwood beams, and resin-coated panels that resisted sand abrasion. Their architecture emphasized translucent windows made from their own glass layers, allowing diffused seaside light into their living spaces. These windows acted as decorative and informative elements, often containing older environmental layers intentionally framed for daily reference. Children learned about changing seasons by observing how different microfossils appeared in the resin. Some families kept personal archives documenting births, storms, migrations of fish, and significant climatic changes. The Bale shoreglass archivists maintained a strict ritual centered around the first cast, a moment each year when young archivist apprentices created their first resin slab. This ceremony took place at the shore during the lowest tide, when the sand was smooth and the organisms most exposed. Apprentices collected microsamples under supervision, selecting fragments that symbolized the year's ecological mood. Tiny crustacean shells, dried seaweed filaments, or grains of volcanic ash carried by distant winds.
Their first slab became part of the main archive, representing not only environmental memory but also the apprentice's role in the civilization. These slabs were carefully cataloged and sealed in dedicated compartments. The Bale Shoreglass archivists developed tools that allowed them to examine their archives with remarkable detail. They constructed simple magnifiers by shaping clear resin into curved lenses. These early lenses enabled them to inspect microfossils and pollen types closely. By comparing different layers with these lenses, they detected subtle changes in species composition. This practice led them to identify long-term cycles in coastal life, such as periodic algal blooms and seasons when shells became thinner, indicating temperature fluctuations or changes in water chemistry. Their ability to interpret these indicators gave them a remarkable awareness of their environment, well beyond the capabilities of most neighboring cultures. The Bale Shoreglass archivists used their archives not only for environmental understanding, but also for record keeping. Significant human events were embedded into specially prepared slabs. They added pigments from crushed minerals, marking births, harvests, alliances, and historical transitions. These event slabs differed from ecological archives because they blended symbolic art with physical samples. Sections of these slabs contained woven patterns of resin-dyed threads, representing years of peace or hardship. The Bale believed that human actions were inseparable from natural cycles, so combining cultural and environmental layers created a unified record of their civilization's existence. The Bale Shoreglass archivists maintained strong connections with coastal guilds from other islands. Their resin slabs were highly valued for both beauty and scientific utility. Traders from distant cultures sought these slabs to study environmental patterns or to use as ceremonial items. The Bale exchanged slabs for woven textiles, stone tools, and rare pigments. Though they sometimes taught others how to cast basic resin layers, they never revealed the advanced mixing ratios and heating techniques that gave their slabs lasting clarity. This guarded knowledge ensured the stability of their cultural identity, as only their community held the full method for creating archive slabs that could last centuries. The decline of the Bale Shoreglass archivists began when the coastline shifted dramatically due to long-term erosion and rising sea levels. Their dune vaults, once safely inland, slowly became vulnerable to storm surges. Several archives were damaged when powerful waves breached the protective dunes, eroding storage chambers and fragmenting centuries-old slabs. Realizing the danger, the Bale attempted to move their archives inland. However, the resin slabs were heavy and fragile, making relocation slow and difficult. Many cracked during transport. Moreover, the inland regions lacked the environmental stability needed for resin production, weakening the foundation of their craft. The Bale Shoreglass archivists faced further challenges as warming trends altered marine ecosystems. Species once abundant in their archives disappeared from the tidal zone. New organisms appeared, but in unpredictable patterns, complicating their ability to read long-term environmental cycles. Without reliable ecological indicators, their predictive methods faltered. Eventually, many communities migrated to more stable shores, bringing fragments of their archives and knowledge. Some integrated with other coastal cultures, sharing pieces of their techniques. What remained of their original civilization gradually faded as storms reclaimed their dunes. The Bale Shoreglass archivists left a legacy preserved in scattered slabs that survived erosion. These slabs, when studied today, reveal layered histories of coastal life. Tiny shells, delicate phytoliths, and grains of dust trapped in resin. The clarity and stability of these pieces demonstrate their advanced craftsmanship. Their civilization stands as an example of environmental memory making, capturing the slow rhythms of nature in translucent layers that still whispered fragments of ancient coastlines.
Vale-run limestone dreamers are described in fragmented coastal legends as a community that lived almost entirely inside naturally hollowed limestone caverns near the edges of pale blue tidal shelves. Their structures were not built in the conventional sense. Instead, they reshaped the interiors of existing caves by smoothing the walls with abrasive shell mixtures and redirecting dripping water to form controlled mineral patterns. The consistent humidity inside these caverns preserved artifacts far better than in open-air settlements, resulting in unusually intact remnants of carved limestone panels, hand-polished stone basins, and fragments of shell mosaics. The dreamer's name comes from interpretations of their remaining wall motifs, countless human figures shown reclining or seated within spirals, as if depicting states of trance, meditation, or ritual dreaming. The Veil Run communities appear to have developed a unique way of recording their thoughts using mineral condensation. Certain chambers contain thin limestone curtains formed from centuries of dripping water. Scratched into these fragile surfaces are faint symbols resembling tidal curves, repeated star shapes, and geometric arcs. When mineral layers formed over them, the symbols were sealed like pages inside crystal sheets. Archaeologists studying them found that the oldest symbols lie deep within the layers, while newer marks appear closer to the surface, forming a natural chronological archive. This suggests the dreamers understood the slow growth of stone and used it intentionally as a long-term diary system, trusting that each generation's markings would be preserved under future mineral layers. Their diet was built on three stable sources: shallow water grazing fish, a species of soft-shelled mollusk found only along limestone-rich coasts, and cultivated cave algae. The algae grew in trays carved directly into cave floors, positioned beneath small openings that allowed controlled shafts of sunlight. These trays contained a mixture of mineral-rich water and ground shell powder, encouraging dense nutrients to accumulate. Fragments of these trays showed deliberate leveling marks, meaning the Veil Run ensured water remained at precise depths. Chemical analysis on preserved algae traces shows that the species they cultivated had unusually high levels of magnesium and calcium, likely contributing to the dreamers' physical resilience in harsh coastal environments. Evidence of their clothing suggests the community combined woven seagrasses with thin limestone dust coatings. The dust acted as a breathable sealant and may have served ceremonial purposes. In deeper chambers, figures in mosaic form are depicted with pale white coats covering their bodies, possibly symbolic representations of individuals considered spiritually attuned. Small bone needles found within those same chambers imply that clothing was stitched with delicate precision despite their limited access to durable fiber materials. The pale mineral coating may also have served to reflect limited cave light, making people easier to see in dim spaces. The Veil Run limestone dreamers appear to have organized their daily life around the rhythmic dripping of water inside their caverns. Certain chambers have natural drip patterns that create repeating percussive rhythms when collected into stone basins. These sounds would echo through the hallways, creating a gentle ambient environment. Some archaeologists believe these acoustic properties were intentionally enhanced by the dreamers through the widening of chambers or strategic placement of hollowed stones. The layout of several caves shows alignment with acoustically resonant points, indicating an understanding of natural sound behavior. Ritual spaces often feature a central basin surrounded by smaller carved seating areas, each positioned at equal distance from the acoustic center. The dreamer's concept of time seems to have been built around mineral accumulation rather than celestial cycles. While most ancient societies track seasons through the sun or moon, the Veil Run appeared to have measured time by observing the growth of stalactites and stalagmites. They marked the progress of stone formations with lines of crushed shell pigment, creating visual indicators of yearly or multi-year growth. These markings allowed them to track long spans of environmental stability. In one exceptionally preserved chamber, 47 pigment lines appear on a single stalagmite, representing at least 47 years of monitored time. This suggests a stable community capable of maintaining consistent ritual observations. The Veil Run practice of dream watching remains one of their most mysterious traditions. Wall carvings show individuals reclining on carved limestone beds placed near water pools.
The carvings depict small mineral threads drawn from the pools toward the reclining figure's head. Some researchers believe this represents a symbolic understanding of reflection, the water surface reflecting sealing minerals above, creating the illusion of movement. Others argue the dreamers used these pools for introspective rituals, in which they studied ripples or mineral reflections to induce meditative states. No signs of psychoactive substances have been found, suggesting the dreamers relied purely on controlled sensory environments for these experiences. One of the most perplexing findings is the presence of stone spheres. Dozens of smooth limestone orbs, ranging from palm-sized to chest-sized, were discovered in deeper tunnels. Their perfectly rounded surfaces show no signs of tool marks, indicating they were shaped through long-term water erosion. However, their arrangement inside chambers, often placed in spirals or paired sets, implies intentional positioning. Scholars debate whether these spheres served symbolic, educational, or observational purposes. Their placement near mineral diary walls suggests they may have been used to represent cycles or states of mind in dreamer philosophy. Trade evidence indicates the Vale Run limestone dreamers interacted with at least 2 neighboring coastal groups. Small artifacts of volcanic glass and dark marine clay, materials not found in limestone regions, have been uncovered inside their living chambers. These items were carved into small pendants or engraved tokens, possibly functioning as markers of exchanged knowledge or symbolic gifts. Despite this, the dreamers do not appear to have engaged in large-scale trade. Rather, exchanges were selective and tied to ceremonial events. Their isolation was deliberate, allowing them to maintain traditions rooted deeply in environmental continuity. The decline of the Vale Run limestone dreamers is associated with major coastal shifts. Geological studies show that rising sea levels gradually flooded their lower cave systems. Instead of relocating inland, the dreamers seem to have retreated deeper into upper caverns, leaving behind flood-damaged artifacts. Eventually, the rising waters likely cut off access to sunlight openings necessary for algae cultivation, destabilizing their food sources. The upper chambers show signs of hurried abandonment: partially carved basins, scattered shell tools, and unsealed limestone diaries. The dreamers may have dispersed into nearby highland communities, though no direct genetic or cultural links have yet been confirmed. The surviving traces present the Vale Run limestone dreamers as a society that embraced patience, slowness, and the rhythm of mineral growth as the foundation of life. Their world moved at the pace of dripping water and quiet stone formation. Their knowledge was shaped in echoing chambers, where each sound, shadow, and reflection carried meaning. Their legacy is preserved not in scrolls or monuments, but in delicate mineral layers that silently carried forward their understanding of time, memory, and inner contemplation.
Nauru cloud shelter wanderers are recorded in scattered highland myths as a society that adapted to life along elevated ridges where persistent low-lying clouds drifted across the cliffs. Their settlements were constructed from lightweight slate panels arranged to redirect moisture from the passing mist into long, narrow channels. These channels fed storage basins carved directly into the rock platforms, allowing the wanderers to collect water without relying on rainfall. Early tools found in these regions indicate that they understood micrometeorology, crafting small stone instruments shaped like hollow cones that emitted tones when wind speed changed. These tonal indicators help them anticipate cloud movements and gauge the density of incoming mist, which determine daily water collection. Early tools found in these regions indicate that they understood micrometeorology, crafting small stone instruments shaped like hollow cones that emitted tones when wind speed changed. These tonal indicators help them anticipate cloud movements and gauge the density of incoming mist, which determine daily water collection. The Nauru diet revolved around cliffside vegetation nourished by the constant moisture of the drifting clouds. One of the most significant plant species they cultivated was a hardy vine with sponge-like leaves capable of absorbing large quantities of water overnight. The leaves were peeled and pressed to extract moisture that contained natural electrolytes formed from mineral-rich fog.
Remains of drying racks carved into cliff walls suggest the wanderers processed these leaves not only for hydration but also for medicinal gels. Chemical tests on preserved plant residues reveal antibacterial properties, explaining how they survived in cold, damp environments without widespread infection. Their clothing was made from two major materials, cliff goat wool and thin fog silk strands produced by a species of high-altitude caterpillar. The wool provided insulation while the fog silk added water resistance. The combination resulted in garments that could retain body heat even when saturated with mist. Intricate grid patterns woven into these garments may have held symbolic meaning regarding cloud cycles or weather predictions. Threads dyed with mineral pigments appear in patterns that match seasonal wind changes, allowing clothing to act as wearable calendars. These garments served practical and cultural purposes, and fragments discovered near old fire pits show signs of careful repair, indicating that clothing held both economic and ceremonial value. Intricate grid patterns woven into these garments may have held symbolic meaning regarding cloud cycles or weather predictions. Threads dyed with mineral pigments appear in patterns that match seasonal wind changes, allowing clothing to act as wearable calendars. These garments served practical and cultural purposes, and fragments discovered near old fire pits show signs of careful repair, indicating that clothing held both economic and ceremonial value. Architecture among the Nauru cloud shelter wanderers was characterized by platforms built on natural shelves, often connected by narrow ledges carved with grip marks. The platforms were angled to catch the thickest parts of drifting clouds. Some structures contained multi-tiered wind boxes that captured moisture and funneled it downward through small carved channels. These wind boxes amplified natural airflow, creating a soft, resonant hum that echoed through the settlements. Such acoustic features likely served as both environmental indicators and psychological tools for grounding during periods of heavy fog. Their ability to manipulate the movement of clouds with subtle architectural choices suggests an understanding of airflow patterns uncommon among early highland societies. One unique feature of Nauru settlements is the presence of cloud mirrors, shallow reflective pools built onto stone platforms. These pools were kept clean by slow drip systems attached to overhead channels. When the sky cleared, the mirrors reflected astronomical patterns otherwise difficult to observe due to frequent cloud cover. The Nauru used these reflections to study star movements and align important structures with celestial pathways. Stone markers arranged near the mirrors show carved patterns representing constellations, but these symbols differ significantly from those of neighboring cultures, implying the wanderers developed an independent astronomical tradition adapted specifically for their climate. The social structure of the Nauru cloud shelter wanderers appears to have revolved around three primary roles: fog readers, ridge gatherers, and wind keepers. Fog readers monitored cloud density and moisture levels using tonal instruments and visual cues. Ridge gatherers were responsible for harvesting cliffside plants and maintaining vine cultivation. Wind keepers maintained the wind boxes, ensuring the flow of air remained steady and controlled. This tripartite system functioned as both labor division and ritual identity, with each role passing between generations through oral teachings during low fog mornings. Carved symbols found near sleeping platforms reflect these distinctions, as individuals mark their living spaces with icons representing their societal role. Communication in fog-heavy environments required adaptations. The Nauru developed a form of echo speech where short, sharp vocal sounds were projected toward cliff faces to judge distance or signal messages. The fog amplified these echoes in unique ways, creating recognizable patterns. Some researchers believe the wanderers could identify individuals by their echo signatures, allowing them to locate one another even when visibility was near zero. Carved diagrams in sheltered alcoves depict lines radiating from human figures toward cliff surfaces, suggesting a conceptual understanding of sound reflection. This echo-based communication was not only functional, but became ritualized during gatherings where echo chants created rhythmic soundscapes. One of the most debated aspects of Nauru culture is their practice of cloud mapping. Evidence of carved stone tablets featuring swirling spirals, arcs, and dotted lines appear throughout highland cave shelters. These symbols have long been interpreted as weather records, showing the movement and shape of clouds over long periods. By comparing these carvings with modern weather patterns in similar regions, researchers found surprising accuracy in how the Nauru recorded the seasonal migration of cloud belts. Some carvings align with modern satellite-documented air currents, raising questions about how the wanderers developed such detailed observations without advanced tools. Their attention to long-term environmental rhythms was critical for survival in their landscape. Burial practices among the Nauru involve constructing wind coffins, hollowed stone slabs placed at angles where strong updrafts occur. Bodies were sealed inside using fog silk and mineral resin. Over time, persistent winds eroded the stone exteriors, revealing smooth surfaces without sharp edges. These wind coffins have been discovered in regions inaccessible without deliberate carving of footholds, proving the wanderers undertook dangerous climbs to maintain ancestral burial traditions. The placement of these coffins suggests symbolic alignment with high-altitude air currents believed to carry the spirit upward. Offerings found inside include small fog harps, miniature tonal instruments that likely served as spiritual escorts. The decline of the Nauru cloud shelter wanderers appears tied to a prolonged reduction in cloud cover documented in geological moisture deposits. As fog became less frequent, water collection systems failed, plant species declined, and cliffside agriculture collapsed. Archaeological evidence shows that the highest and most cloud-dependent settlements were abandoned first. Lower settlements persisted longer, but eventually showed signs of resource scarcity and structural collapse. Stone markers abruptly end in several cloud mapping tablets, hinting that the environmental shift was rapid enough to disrupt cultural continuity. Despite their disappearance, traces of their cloud mapping methods influenced neighboring highland groups as similar patterns appear in later cultures. The remaining artifacts portray the Nauru cloud shelter wanderers as a society deeply connected to the movement of mist and the hush of drifting clouds. Their understanding of moisture, airflow, and acoustic communication reveal a scientific sensitivity often overlooked in early highland communities. Their legacy persists in the silent wind boxes, the scarred cliff ledges, and the faint tonal instruments scattered across ancient ridges, reminders of a civilization that lived within the gentle rhythm of clouds and listened to the sky as though it carried stories in every passing breath.
Vasu reed mammonists maintained a unique archival tradition built entirely on tactile memory embedded in woven reeds. Their settlements formed along winding river networks where reeds grew in dense, workable clusters. The reeds were selected at different stages of maturity depending on the type of knowledge to be stored. Young, flexible reeds were used for fluid narratives such as seasonal histories, while older, stiffer reeds served for documenting trade routes, births, deaths, and resource inventories. Analysis of surviving fragments shows intentional variation in texture, thickness, and knot tension, allowing each woven tape to communicate multiple layers of information simultaneously. Their reed tapes worked on a principle similar to quipu and memory textiles, but the Vasu developed a far more complex multisensory encoding system. Over time, the tapes became hybrid devices, part code, part artwork, part ceremonial object. Each thread incorporated calculated tension patterns readable through touch, enabling elders to recite ancestral knowledge in complete darkness. The position of knots indicated chronological order, while spacing represented temporal density. Long gaps meant uneventful seasons, tightly packed knots signaled periods of crisis or abundance. Some tapes contained microsegments of split reed, creating sharp contrasts in texture to mark important transitions such as drought onset or river migrations. Geographically, Vasu settlements spread across 3 major floodplains connected by tributaries that predictably overflowed during seasonal pulses. Instead of building fixed stone sites, they constructed semi-mobile reed domes anchored using silk-packed bases.
These domes could be dismantled when floods approached and reassembled as needed. Their mobility allowed them to track river shifts over decades, adjusting to changing geographic patterns. Because rivers altered course frequently, the Vasu became expert geomorphologists long before the term existed. They observed sediment loads, water clarity, and floating debris to predict river migrations. The earliest recorded environmental patterns in their tapes align with modern fluvial modeling of floodplain dynamics. The Vasu reed mnemonists also developed a distinctive educational system centered on memorization walks. Young learners followed elders along riverbanks while touching reed tapes linked to landmarks. Each bend in the river matched a coded section of the tape, creating a physical relationship between geography and memory. The technique resembled a proto-memory palace, but instead of architectural locations, natural features served as spatial anchors. This system created generational continuity, enabling the Vasu to preserve accurate knowledge of river channels for centuries, even when landscapes continually transformed. Their agriculture revolved around flood cycle planting strategies. They grew floating seed beds tethered to river shallows using weighted stones. These seed beds drifted gently with currents, spreading root systems across silt layers. This method prevented crop drowning during floods and minimized erosion. The most common crops included reed millet, water tubers, and a rare high-protein marsh bean that thrived in suspended soil. Tools found near cultivation zones include curved bone scrapers for clearing algae off seed beds, small wicker paddles for directing plant clusters, and reed partitions used to regulate water flow across agricultural fields. The Vasu maintained a symbiotic relationship with water birds, particularly herons and marsh cranes. Their tapes contain sequences of repeating nuts that correspond to bird migratory patterns. Archaeologists believe the Vasu used these patterns not only for ecological tracking, but also for timekeeping. The presence of birds at specific points along the river was a seasonal indicator comparable to a natural calendar. They constructed tall reed towers along riverbanks to observe migration, using reflective shell chips at the tops to attract birds, making data collection easier. These towers doubled as signaling posts, as the shiny fragments could reflect sunlight to distant settlements. Their oral tradition flourished in riverside amphitheaters, semicircular clearings shaped with layered reed mats to amplify sound. These mats were engineered with staggered spacing that improved resonance at low frequencies. The Vasu, unlike many other ancient river cultures, preferred slow, evenly spaced narration. The pacing matched breathing rhythms and allowed the audience to internalize tactile information when tapes were passed around. Surviving amphitheater foundations show intentional placement along natural acoustic corridors where river flow softened background noise, demonstrating an advanced understanding of sound ecology. One of the most complex reed artifacts discovered is the Flow Archive, a multi-layered weave containing over 200 coded clusters. The clusters align with historical fluctuations in river discharge reconstructed by sediment cores. This alignment proves that the Vasu reed mnemonists collected longitudinal hydrological data comparable to modern scientific river monitoring. The Flow Archive maps not only water levels, but also shifts in fish populations, insect cycles, algae blooms, and major flood events. It is evidence that the Vasu treated their environment as a living chronology. Economic activity within the Vasu culture relied on reed-based crafts, including water-resistant containers, folding baskets, and lightweight rafts. The rafts incorporated diagonal reed braids and internal buoyancy pockets made by trapping air between layered membranes. Some rafts show tar-like resin coatings derived from riverbank tree sap, improving durability. These rafts allowed safe movement across flooded zones and extended trade routes along tributaries. The Vasu exchanged reed dyes, medicinal marsh herbs, and coated tapes with neighboring cultures. In return, they acquired minerals, pottery, and rare seeds not found in wetland ecosystems. Religion within the reed communities revolved around the concept of flow memory, the belief that rivers stored echoes of past lives. Ceremonies involved immersing reed tapes in shallow water, allowing currents to pass over them. The Vasu believed the movement of water activated ancestral voices locked within knot patterns. Ritual leaders interpreted the frequency of vibrations created as water brushed against the tapes, converting them into seasonal predictions. This ritual practice blended empirical observation with spiritual symbolism, reinforcing the connection between people and river cycles. Burial traditions involved crafting reed cocoons wrapped with woven stories describing the individual's life path. The density and curvature of the cocoon reflected personality traits. Tightly wound cocoons represented disciplined individuals, while loose weaves indicated fluid, adaptive temperaments. Bodies were placed in shallow marsh beds where decomposition enriched the soil. Above each bed, the Vasu planted memory reeds, a special variety whose height and coloration changed depending on soil nutrients. These reeds transformed the floodplain into a living cemetery that displayed the history of entire generations through patterns of vegetation. The decline of the Vasu reed Mamanists coincided with the prolonged drying of river channels. Geological evidence suggests a multi-decade drought forced the rivers to contract, destabilizing the reed ecosystems essential to their survival. As water receded, their floating seedbeds cracked under exposure, water birds migrated elsewhere, and the once abundant reed forests thinned dramatically. Fragmented tapes from late settlements show increasingly chaotic knot patterns, suggesting a breakdown in record keeping. The final tapes document attempts to migrate downstream, but no subsequent settlements contain Vasu-style weaves. The culture dissolved into emerging agricultural societies that relied on more stable land-based farming. Despite their disappearance, modern hydrologists studying ancient flood cycles reference Vasu techniques for tactile environmental recording. Tapes preserved in dry caves have revealed precise documentation of river pulses that align with modern sediment analysis. The Vasu reed Mamanists remain one of the most advanced tactile knowledge keepers in pre-instrument history, demonstrating a deep understanding of rivers as both ecological systems and memory-bearing entities.
Taurian brine harps developed an acoustic meteorology tradition centered around tensioned membranes stretched above engineered brine pools. These pools were constructed in naturally sunken salt flats where evaporation rates were high, allowing the Taurian to control salinity with remarkable precision. Each brine pool was shaped as an elongated oval, bordered by packed salt walls that amplified resonance. Above the pools, membranes made of animal gut, reed fiber composites, or stretched fish skin films were suspended using wooden frames. When ocean winds passed over the membranes, they vibrated at specific frequencies determined by tension, ambient humidity, and salt concentration. The Taurian used these vibrations to interpret changes in weather, seasonal wind shifts, and incoming storms long before the sky showed visible signs. Their settlements were located in coastal depressions where seawater naturally seeped into the terrain. Instead of resisting the encroaching saltwater, the Taurian embraced it, transforming the environment into an open-air laboratory. They built tiered brine systems where water flowed from high salinity pools into low salinity ones. Each tier produced different sound signatures as wind interacted with the membranes. In some cases, the Taurian installed multiple membranes over a single pool, creating layered harmonics. These harmonics acted like a natural early warning system, with specific tones indicating moisture shifts, temperature gradients, and pressure changes. The deeper the hum, the more likely a storm was approaching from distant regions. Historical remnants of Taurian brine sites reveal a sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics. The Taurian carved shallow channels allowing water to circulate and evaporate at controlled rates. As evaporation increased salinity, the density of the water changed, producing subtle differences in the acoustic reflections coming from the membranes. Researchers examining the site patterns have noted that Taurian brine pools correlate with wind direction corridors mapped through modern climatology. These placements were not random. They maximized wind exposure to extract the clearest sound signatures.
This alignment demonstrates that the Taoran possessed long-term observational knowledge of wind movement, humidity cycles, and mesoscale weather patterns. The Taoran brine harps incorporated harmonic patterns into their social and agricultural practices. For example, they observed that certain frequencies corresponded with seasonal moisture availability. When the membranes produced high, sharp tones, it indicated dry inland winds, prompting the Taoran to focus on gathering salt-tolerant coastal plants. When frequencies dropped into low oscillations, the community anticipated wet ocean air, which signaled the forthcoming germination period for shoreline tubers. Over generations, they developed a cyclical agricultural calendar entirely based on brine harp acoustics. Culturally, the brine harps served as communal instruments during ceremonies. During solstices, the Taoran gathered around the largest brine pool, known as the Central Resonance Basin. Here, the membrane was so large that its vibrations were felt through the ground. Participants stood barefoot on compressed salt platforms, allowing them to sense the vibrations as physical pulses. These rituals were accompanied by slow chanting synchronized with the oscillations of the membrane. Chanting was believed to calibrate the air, reinforcing harmony between humans, wind, and the coastline. Oral records describe elders interpreting the subtle interactions between ritual chanting and natural wind resonance to predict the quality of the upcoming harvest. Material analysis suggests the Taoran experimented with varying membrane compositions. Fish skin membranes produced richer tonal ranges, while reed fiber composites created sharper, more percussive sounds. The Taoran recognized how moisture absorption affected tension, and they treated membranes with salt coatings to maintain durability. Some membranes were layered, combining different materials to create frequency filtering effects. These experimental approaches suggest a proto-scientific mindset where empirical trial and error shaped their understanding of acoustics. The Taoran brine engineers also constructed wind funnels, angled reed corridors that directed airflow towards specific brine pools. By channeling wind into narrower passages, they increased velocity and enhanced membrane vibration. These wind funnels function similarly to modern aerodynamic systems used to study laminar and turbulent flow. Through long-term observation, the Taoran learned to distinguish which funnel-produced tones were natural and which indicated environmental anomalies, such as heat surges or abnormal humidity. Geographically, the Taoran lived along shorelines with high solar exposure. Their brine pools relied on predictable evaporation cycles, and the Taoran mapped regions where the combination of sun and wind produced ideal conditions. They developed a mobile settlement design in which structures could be disassembled and relocated when salt flats shifted or when new seepage zones emerged. Living in such dynamic salt environments required adaptable architecture, so they created modular salt brick homes coated with brine for structural integrity. These homes were arranged in circular layouts around the central brine harps, creating acoustic corridors where sound traveled cleanly across the settlement. Taoran knowledge systems were passed down through apprenticeships. Young learners spent afternoons listening to membranes under varying conditions. Elders taught them to identify tonal changes caused by temperature, time of day, or cloud coverage. Training required acute sensitivity to sound. Children practiced by reproducing frequencies vocally, strengthening their auditory memory. This practice produced generations of skilled sound readers, individuals capable of identifying atmospheric changes through micro variations in membrane vibration. In addition to weather prediction, the Taoran used brine harp data to track long-term climate changes. Some of the oldest brine pools show modifications in wall height, indicating attempts to adjust resonance in response to shifting wind patterns. These adjustments form a chronological record of environmental change. The Taoran integrated this knowledge into migration planning, gradually relocating settlements when low-frequency harmonics indicated long-term climatic desiccation. Their ability to adapt allowed the culture to thrive across multiple centuries of fluctuating coastal conditions. Trade connections formed when nearby cultures discovered the Taoran's unique meteorological abilities. The Tauren exchanged predictive information in the form of carved salt tablets, each tablet capturing a sequence of membrane frequencies associated with specific weather patterns. These tablets traveled along maritime trade routes, and neighboring cultures relied on them for navigation and crop planning. The Tauren often accompanied trade missions, serving as weather advisors who could read ocean wind patterns on open water by listening to portable membrane frames stretched across wooden rings. Ritual beliefs intertwined with acoustic science. The Tauren believed winds were messengers carrying distant memories. Brine harps were considered instruments that translated these messages. A tone shift was interpreted as a change in the mood of the atmosphere, prompting the community to adjust daily activities. Although spiritualized in narrative form, these interpretations often aligned with real meteorological signals. This merging of belief and observation created a stable cultural system that balanced empirical environmental monitoring with communal identity. As salt flats became increasingly unstable due to long-term shoreline retreat, the Tauren faced declining brine harp performance. Membranes sagged as humidity patterns changed, and the pools began filling with silt rather than seawater. Late archaeological records show attempts to build elevated brine platforms, but these structures could not replicate the natural environmental acoustics. Gradually, Tauren settlements dispersed, merging into inland societies that had more stable freshwater systems. What survived the collapse were fragments of membrane frames and etched salt blocks, documenting centuries of acoustic meteorology. Today, acoustic engineers studying natural resonators compare Tauren brine designs to modern infrasound monitoring instruments. The Tauren demonstrated an intuitive mastery of how wind, water, salt, and tension interact in producing measurable signals. Their civilization remains an example of how ancient communities extracted scientific knowledge from environmental soundscapes without formal instruments, relying purely on careful listening, structured experimentation, and generational observation.
Narathine's salt mirror astronomers shaped their entire knowledge system around the unusual reflective basins that surrounded their island, wide stretches of hypersaline tidal plains that created natural mirrors capable of producing clear star reflections even during faint moonlight. Their environment offered them a rare observational advantage, and the Narathene used it to build one of the earliest and most sophisticated traditions of sky measurement in ancient maritime cultures. Their practice developed through steady observation rather than mythic interpretation, and their surviving carvings reveal a systematic approach to tracking stellar movement through the mirrored surface of the salt plains. The island's position near the transitional zone of seasonal winds meant the night skies remained stable for long periods, allowing them to detect minor celestial changes that many neighboring civilizations never noticed. Their reflective pools were arranged into tiered observation cascades, with shallow basins at the upper levels and deeper ones below, enabling them to compare distorted and undistorted sky reflections simultaneously. This technique allowed them to recognize differences in luminosity, angular drift, and atmospheric effects long before they had formal terminology to describe any of these concepts. The Narathene developed a layered observational record system based on etched quartz tablets that resisted salt corrosion. These tablets contained sequences of repeating star positions indexed by the intensity of reflection, not by directional orientation. Their system categorized stars according to how sharply they appeared in the mirror water. This unusual method is now considered an early precursor to magnitude classification, although the Narathene did not conceive it as mathematical astronomy, but rather as a way of knowing which stars could be trusted for navigation during haze seasons. They also mapped the slow rise and fall of ocean levels in relation to the night sky, discovering a reliable connection between tidal height patterns and the visibility of certain constellations. These correlations were not framed as cosmic influence, but as environmental synchrony. The Narathene believed that the world maintained internal consistency across sky and sea, and that careful observation revealed this unspoken order. Their architecture complemented their astronomical interests.
Narrathene structures were constructed from densely compacted saltstone blocks that settled with minimal shifting, giving their elevated platforms long-term stability for precise measurements. The main observation terraces were designed with slight concave inclines to funnel condensation into narrow channels. The water collected in these channels was directed into auxiliary viewing basins used only during still nights when ocean winds dropped. The absence of ripples was crucial to their measurements, and so entire casts existed to maintain windbreak screens made of woven dune reeds around the viewing terraces. These screens were replaced seasonally to ensure they remained flexible and did not produce their own disruptive currents. Every aspect of their observational environment was engineered to minimize noise in the reflective data. In their written tradition, the Narrathene described a phenomenon they called the turning of the shallow heavens, referring to the slow shift of certain reflected star paths across the salt plains over generations. Modern analysis suggests this was an early recognition of precession, though the Narrathene interpreted it through environmental cycles rather than cosmic geometry. They believed the sky's mirrored face moved as the island's salt crust breathed with the seasons, an interpretation rooted in observation rather than symbolic myth. Their star calendars tracked multiple cycles at once: the synodic month, the annual solar path, recurring cloud shadow seasons, and long-range ocean swell patterns. Each tablet included notations on how each cycle affected mirror clarity, making their archive an extensive record not only of celestial motion but also of local climate patterns. The Narrathene did not isolate astronomy as a priestly or elite pursuit. Instead, reflective observation was integrated into daily routines. Fisher groups used morning mirror readings to predict offshore current shifts. Salt harvesters relied on seasonal light angle tables to determine optimal evaporation phases. Even children participated in constellation finding exercises at dusk as part of their early education. Because mirrors were everywhere in the Narrathene world, large natural ones and small household ones, the habit of interpreting reflections became cultural instinct. Their language developed multiple verbs to distinguish degrees of mirrored clarity: distortions caused by wind, distortions caused by mineral density, and distortions caused by cloud cover. These distinctions created a vocabulary of precision that supported their observational accuracy. One of the most important aspects of Narrathene scientific practice was the salt line meridian, a perfectly straight channel carved through the densest portion of the plains. This channel ran for hundreds of meters and held a consistent depth maintained daily by specialist caretakers. The static water line allowed them to detect minimal shifts in horizon alignment. When a star's reflection drifted even slightly outside the channel's edges, the shift was recorded. Over decades, patterns emerged that indicated much larger cycles at play. Their ability to detect tiny angular changes was heightened by the fact that salt water created exceptionally crisp reflections under certain conditions. The salt line meridian functioned as a human-made instrument thousands of years before the invention of precise metallic astronomical tools. The collapse of the Narrathene culture traces back to a series of inlet floods that reshaped the salt plains. Tectonic pressure caused the island to tilt gradually toward the east, leading to uneven flooding patterns that destroyed the consistency of their mirror surfaces. Many of their basins became brackish and turbulent, losing the clarity required for their astronomical system. Attempts to construct new terraces on higher ground failed because the mineral composition differed too strongly from the original plains. Their knowledge system depended on environmental stability, and once that stability eroded, the culture's scientific core weakened. People migrated inland or toward other coastal zones, carrying their quartz tablets with them, though few survived due to centuries of salt abrasion and trade handling. Despite the collapse, the Narrathene influence extended across maritime trade routes. Several coastal cultures later adopted simplified mirror reading techniques to improve navigation. Fragments of Narrathene notation appear in carvings far from their island, suggesting their methods were shared through traveling scholars or sailors who valued predictive tide sky correlations. The legacy of the Narethene salt mirror astronomers rests not on monumental architecture or military expansion, but on their precise and continuous observation of reflected light across time. Their worldview demonstrated that scientific insight can emerge from environmental familiarity rather than abstract theory, and that a civilization built on stillness and reflection can achieve exactness unmatched by more technologically aggressive societies.
Aerolith Cliffs wind carvers developed their culture on an island defined by towering basalt precipices that rose sharply from the sea, creating powerful vertical wind channels. These channels shaped not only the island's ecology, but also the techniques, tools, and worldview of the wind carvers themselves. Their civilization centered on the ability to read, measure, and manipulate airflow with remarkable precision, relying on the cliff's natural acoustics as instruments for environmental analysis. The wind carvers observed the way wind vibrated across stone surfaces, generating distinct resonance patterns that changed according to weather fronts, seasonal shifts, and atmospheric pressure variations. Their early recordings of resonance patterns, etched on slate slabs, represent one of the earliest known attempts to document wind behavior in a systematic manner. Their understanding of wind originated from necessity. The island's position along a tri-directional convergence of maritime currents caused unstable air currents that could shift unpredictably. Without predicting wind shifts accurately, sea travel became extremely dangerous. To survive, the wind carvers cultivated precise sensory awareness of airflow. The cliffs, shaped by erosion into natural corridors, amplified this ability. Each corridor had its own acoustic signature based on the width, angle, and mineral density of its stone surfaces. When winds passed through, they produced tones that the people learned to interpret. Over generations, the wind carvers constructed additional artificial ridges to refine the tonal precision, adjusting pitch and resonance until the cliffs functioned as a large-scale wind observatory. The wind carvers developed specialized instruments called aerocords, thin, stretched membranes made from animal sinew or sea-soaked plant fibers. These membranes were suspended across cliff gaps and vibrated with passing wind. By placing aerocords at different altitudes, they built a tiered system that translated wind speed and direction into tonal sequences. The membrane's tension could be altered by humidity, so the wind carvers incorporated moisture readings into their atmospheric interpretations. Their knowledge allowed them to forecast storms with impressive accuracy. Many coastal cultures later adopted simplified versions of aerocords after encountering wind carver navigators who shared their wind reading techniques. Architecture played a functional role in strengthening their relationship with the winds. Houses were carved directly into the cliff faces, oriented in alignment with specific airflow patterns. Air ducts, narrow horizontal slits cut into the rock, channeled ventilation throughout the interior while also allowing inhabitants to detect subtle pressure changes. These ducts produced faint whistles when storm fronts approached, giving families early warnings. On calm days, the ducts remained silent, and the people used the stillness to maintain or repair aerocords on the exterior ledges. Living spaces were arranged to minimize exposure to sudden gusts, with curved interior walls designed to distribute pressure evenly. The wind carvers were early masters of aerodynamic architecture long before such concepts were formalized. Central to their scientific worldview was the Aerolith Codex, an evolving archive of wind patterns spanning centuries. The codex was carved onto long basalt panels that were replaced or expanded when cliffs eroded. Each entry described wind cycles, cliff resonance profiles, and accompanying changes in the behavior of local birds, whose flight patterns were considered secondary atmospheric indicators. These records formed an empirical foundation for predicting seasonal shifts, droughts, and migratory patterns. Rather than interpreting wind as a supernatural force, the wind carvers saw it as an observable phenomenon governed by consistency and rhythm. Their cultural identity was built on mastering the unseen through careful sensory calibration. The wind carvers also developed symbolic yet practical wind mapping techniques using airborne pigments.
They released finely ground mineral powders from high ledges to observe how the wind carried the particles across the cliff face. Different powder densities revealed layering effects within the airflow. Lighter powders rose higher, while heavier ones traced lower channels. Over time, these experiments produced detailed three-dimensional airflow maps. These maps helped them determine where to place new aero cords, how to design wind shelters, and which cliff routes were safest for traversal. The pigments themselves were engineered from volcanic ash, coral dust, and iron-rich sediments, chosen for their contrasting visibility against the dark basalt. Agriculture on Aerolith Island was strongly influenced by wind management. The people built terraced farms on the leeward side of the cliffs, using stone windbreak arcs that diverted harsh gusts upward and prevented soil erosion. These terraces were irrigated using fog nets that captured moisture from passing mist. The wind carvers recognized that fog carried different mineral concentrations depending on wind direction, so they documented which fog sources produced the most nutrient-rich water. These differences shaped planting cycles. They grew hardy plants with deep roots capable of anchoring into thin cliff-top soils. Their agricultural productivity exceeded what the harsh landscape should have allowed because of this careful environmental optimization. The social hierarchy of the wind carvers was based on skill rather than lineage. The most respected individuals were resonance specialists who memorized hundreds of tonal patterns. Initiated students underwent rigorous training, spending long periods in sensory deprivation alcoves carved into the cliff walls to hone their ability to detect small tonal variations. These alcoves blocked visual distractions and magnified faint acoustic cues. Master resonance specialists demonstrated the capacity to identify micro-shifts in pitch before storms formed over the sea. Their expertise saved countless lives by allowing coastal teams to secure boats, nets, and storage pits ahead of weather changes. Despite their achievements, the wind carver civilization faced a significant challenge: long-term geological instability. The island sat near a tectonic hinge where tectonic plates shifted unpredictably. Over centuries, vertical fault movements altered the cliff angles, changing the resonant tones and effectively invalidating large sections of the aerolith codex. As the cliff shifted, the wind paths became inconsistent, creating chaotic patterns that confounded even the most skilled specialists. The aero chords vibrated unpredictably, producing mixed tones that masked reliable forecasting signals. These geological disturbances undermined the environmental consistency on which their science relied. The wind carvers responded by constructing new observatory terraces on more stable sections of the island, but the tectonic shifts eventually fractured these areas as well. When cliff collapses became more frequent, the people began relocating inland to the central plateau, where wind conditions were less predictable and unsuitable for their traditional methods. Without stable resonance channels, they could not maintain their precise forecasting culture. Over time, their knowledge system fragmented. Some migrated to other islands, where they introduced basic wind reading practices, though these were simplified due to the lack of suitable cliffs. The original sophistication of the wind carver science gradually faded as environmental changes removed the foundation that made it possible. Today, what remains of their civilization consists of eroded cliff dwellings, partially collapsed resonance alcoves, and fragments of basalt panels inscribed with segments of the aerolith codex. The surviving inscriptions reveal a culture that viewed wind not as a chaotic force, but as an intricate field of patterns that could be decoded. Their contribution to ancient science lies in their systematic approach to studying air movement, which anticipated later aerodynamic principles. Their legacy demonstrates how environmental mastery can produce advanced observational systems without reliance on metallurgy, writing inks, or complex instruments. Their civilization exemplifies the potential of sensory-based science rooted entirely in natural geography.
The Lasha Echo Keepers developed their civilization around a network of volcanic caverns whose structure made the island one of the most acoustically unique environments in the ancient world. These caverns formed when molten basalt cooled rapidly along the island's coastal fringe, leaving behind long tubes, hollow chambers, and narrow resonance corridors.
When wind pushed through these geological structures, the air vibrated with low-frequency tones that traveled far deeper into the caverns than ordinary sound. Over centuries, the echo keepers studied these tones, eventually mapping their reflections to understand how sound behaved in enclosed stone environments. Their mapping system became the basis of an entire cultural tradition built on the preservation and interpretation of voices through resonance. The earliest evidence of their culture shows that they discovered the acoustic properties by accident. Hunters seeking shelter during storms spoke inside the caverns and noticed their voices returning seconds or minutes later, depending on chamber depth. These returning echoes were not faint or distorted. Instead, they were clear enough to be mistaken for other people speaking. This clarity came from the alignment of basalt layers, which acted as natural sound guides. Over generations, the echo keepers learned that specific chambers amplified low tones, while others sustained mid-range frequencies. They began cataloging these spaces not by visual features, but by the echoes they produced. This practice evolved into an acoustic cartography that rivaled written systems in complexity. The earliest evidence of their culture shows that they discovered the acoustic properties by accident. Hunters seeking shelter during storms spoke inside the caverns and noticed their voices returning seconds or minutes later, depending on chamber depth. These returning echoes were not faint or distorted. Instead, they were clear enough to be mistaken for other people speaking. This clarity came from the alignment of basalt layers, which acted as natural sound guides. Over generations, the echo keepers learned that specific chambers amplified low tones, while others sustained mid-range frequencies. They began cataloging these spaces not by visual features, but by the echoes they produced. This practice evolved into an acoustic cartography that rivaled written systems in complexity. The Lasha people believed sound had memory because stone held vibration longer than water or air. However, unlike many civilizations that spiritualize natural phenomena, the echo keepers turned this belief into empirical study. They measured the delay time of echoes using dripping water as a metronome. The interval between drop impacts allowed them to calculate how long a sound stayed alive in each chamber. Over centuries, they developed a numerical scale for resonance duration. Caverns with long echo decay times became archives where they stored spoken knowledge. Elders recited genealogies or seasonal data inside these chambers, allowing the resonance to imprint temporarily into the space. Other members of the society could return later to hear faint remnants of the recorded material. Although not permanent, these sound archives preserved information long enough to be retrievable for practical purposes. To enhance the natural properties of the caverns, the echo keepers carved angled surfaces into chamber walls. These angles redirected sound waves to prolong resonance. They also installed smooth basalt plates that reduced scattering, producing cleaner echoes. Their work showed an advanced understanding of acoustic geometry. They recognized that surfaces needed to be carved gently rather than sharply. Sharp cuts dispersed sound too quickly. This knowledge allowed them to expand the functionality of the caverns, transforming them from natural curiosities into engineered information spaces. The largest engineered chamber known today from archaeological reconstructions was capable of sustaining a clear tone for nearly 20 seconds, an extraordinary result for a civilization without metal tools. The society's communication system extended beyond the caverns. The Lasha constructed standing stone pillars across mountain ridges. These pillars, when struck with wooden mallets, produced specific frequencies that carried through the air. Certain frequencies traveled farther on humid nights, while others were clearer during dry periods. By combining different tones, they transmitted encoded messages between settlements. These messages were not linguistic in the modern sense, but worked more like warnings, signals, or schedule markers. For example, two low notes followed by a high one indicated incoming storms. A repeating mid-tone pattern signaled a community gathering. Their acoustic signaling system functioned as a long-distance communication network without requiring sight lines or fire-based methods. Socially, the echo keepers placed high value on individuals capable of interpreting sound patterns. Children were trained early to distinguish between echoes of different lengths and frequencies. Those with exceptional auditory sensitivity became resonance scholars, responsible for maintaining the knowledge stored in the caverns. Their training involved sitting in pitch-dark chambers for hours, listening to the interplay of multiple echoes. They learned to separate fresh echoes from fading ones and to detect subtle shifts caused by seasonal humidity changes. These abilities ensured that oral records were accurately retrieved and updated. Because their society relied heavily on acoustic preservation, the echo keepers developed remarkably strong memories and refined listening skills. The environment shaped their architectural choices as well. Homes were built with curved interiors that reflected sound away from living spaces to reduce echo noise. This design kept conversations private, a necessity in a culture where echoes could persist. The materials used were chosen for their acoustic behavior. Thick basalt slabs for outer walls, porous stone for inner partitions to absorb excess sound, and wood coverings to soften high-frequency reflections. Even cooking hearths were shaped to minimize reverberation. These architectural practices reveal how deeply the echo keepers integrated sound management into daily life. Their agricultural strategies were equally adapted to island conditions. Terraces were carved into volcanic slopes to maximize soil retention. The echo keepers paid close attention to how wind carried moisture, using natural sound indicators to anticipate fog development. When fog gathered on the coastal side of the island, audible shifts in wind harmonics within certain chambers signaled increased humidity hours before it became visible. Farmers used this forecast to prepare their fog nets, ensuring maximum water capture. This synergy between atmospheric acoustics and agriculture made their food production unusually stable for a volcanic island. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Lasha civilization was its approach to knowledge inheritance. Instead of writing, they used echo rituals. A new generation would enter a chamber with an elder who recited essential cultural information. As the elder's voice reverberated, the young listeners learned to hear the decay pattern and understand the rhythmic structure behind the echo. This rhythm helped them memorize long passages efficiently. Although the echoes themselves eventually faded, the ritual ensured the information persisted through human memory. It was a hybrid system of natural acoustics and cognitive reinforcement. Despite their ingenuity, the echo keepers faced a catastrophic threat: seismic activity. The island sat on a tectonic fracture zone, and over centuries, earthquakes subtly altered chamber structures. Even minor shifts changed resonance properties. Chambers once used for long-duration echoes became acoustically unstable. Some produced chaotic reflections that made stored echoes impossible to interpret. The collapse of several key resonance vaults significantly weakened their information system. As the caverns deteriorated, so did their method of archiving knowledge. Without their acoustic infrastructure, the echo keepers lost the primary tool that held their society together. Eventually, many communities migrated to neighboring islands, carrying fragments of their resonance traditions. Some integrated their sound-based practices into new environments, though without basalt caverns, the original acoustic complexity could not be recreated. Over generations, the pure form of Lasha echo culture faded. What survived was a simplified tradition of rhythmic chanting and the use of small echo stones as memory aids. Archaeologists studying the ruins have identified traces of polished basalt plates and carved resonance paths, confirming that their acoustic engineering approached a sophistication rare among ancient island societies. Today, the legacy of the Lasha echo keepers stands as evidence of how a civilization can develop advanced scientific understanding through sensory observation alone. Their mastery of resonance, atmospheric acoustics, and geological sound behavior place them among the most acoustically knowledgeable cultures of the ancient world. Their approach illustrates how environmental constraints can inspire unique forms of knowledge storage and communication, making the Lasha echo keepers a remarkable example of natural science emerging without written systems, metallurgy, or external influence.
The Renu spiral tillers organized their entire civilization around a system of agriculture that was unlike anything seen in other ancient island cultures. Their farming method revolved around constructing logarithmic spiral terraces across volcanic slopes, each terrace aligned with the sun's seasonal angles and natural water runoff patterns. This geometry created microclimates that allowed them to cultivate crops year-round despite unpredictable rainfall and steep terrain. Their spiral formations were not decorative. They were the result of centuries of iterative observation, experimentation, and optimization. The core of their method relied on understanding how sunlight moved across curved landforms. While many societies built straight terraces that captured sunlight in broad segments, the Renu discovered that spiral terraces distributed sunlight more evenly through the day. As the sun crossed the sky, each segment of the spiral received a slightly different angle of light exposure. This produced temperature gradients that allowed a wide variety of crops to grow in close proximity, each thriving in its ideal microzone. Crops requiring higher heat were placed on the outer spiral arms where sunlight lasted longer, while shade-tolerant plants grew in the center where walls cast protective shadows. This structured diversity stabilized their food system against seasonal failures. Their understanding of erosion control was equally advanced. Most terrace societies built retaining walls perpendicular to slope direction. But the Renu discovered that water flow naturally followed curved paths, not straight ones. By shaping terraces into logarithmic arcs, they slowed water movement without creating destructive pressure points. During heavy rains, water spiraled downward in a controlled pattern, depositing nutrient-rich sediments along the route. This system functioned like a passive irrigation network that redistributed minerals instead of washing them away. Archaeological surveys of their abandoned spiral terraces show soil layers far thicker than surrounding areas, confirming the long-term success of their erosion management strategies. The Renu believed the island's volcanic landscape was a living body, with water acting as its circulating blood. They viewed each terrace spiral as a vein that guided the island's nourishment. However, this spiritual symbolism did not replace empirical study. Their priest engineers measured rainfall using stone basins carved with radial calibration lines, allowing them to calculate seasonal water volume. They tracked how quickly terraces dried after storms and adjusted stone placement accordingly. Their spiral geometries were not artistic improvisations, but mathematical constructions derived from observing natural patterns in shells, vines, whirlpools, and hurricanes. Each year, the Renu conducted what they called the Great Spiral Maintenance. Entire communities worked together to repair wall curvatures, clear channels, and align stones with astronomical markers. This collective maintenance was essential. A single broken section could disrupt water flow for the entire formation. The Renu used obsidian sighting rods to check curvature consistency. These rods were laid along terrace edges to ensure the arcs followed precise angles. Their consistency across generations shows a standardized geometric system rare for a society without writing. Beyond engineering, their agriculture relied on a sophisticated understanding of plant succession. The Renu practiced rotational planting in concentric zones. The outer rings were used for fast-growing annuals such as millet and island yams, which thrived in warm sunlit areas. The middle zones contained legumes and nitrogen-fixing plants that enriched the soil. The innermost rings supported medicinal herbs, mosses, and shade crops that preferred the cooler microclimate. This dynamic, multi-layered crop system ensured soil fertility without the need for external fertilizers. Researchers analyzing the soil remnants note unusually high nitrogen and phosphorus levels, reflecting centuries of nutrient cycling. The Renu spiral tillers also maintain seed vaults built into the spiral centers. These underground chambers use the naturally cool, stable temperatures at the spiral's core to store seeds for future seasons. The chambers were shaped with slightly concave walls to prevent condensation from dripping onto stored materials.
The design acted as a passive refrigeration system, preserving genetic diversity across generations. The Renu prioritized resilience. If a drought wiped out outer spiral crops, the seed vault ensured rapid recovery. Their civilization extended this spiral logic into architecture as well. Homes were built with curved walls that promoted airflow. By shaping houses like miniature spirals, they captured wind from multiple directions and channeled it through living spaces. This passive ventilation kept interiors cool in the hot season and reduced mold in the wet season. The Renu believed straight lines were unstable in nature. They broke under pressure, while curves distributed force. This belief appears repeatedly in their construction techniques. Stone foundations were wide arcs that resist earthquakes more effectively than sharp-cornered structures. Some of their circular meeting halls still stand today because their geometry allowed seismic waves to pass through without collapsing the structure. Their understanding of astronomy contributed to the precision of their terraces. Stone pillars placed at key spiral points aligned with sunrise positions at the solstices and equinoxes. These alignments served as agricultural calendars. When the sun rose exactly between specific markers, farmers knew when to begin planting or harvesting particular crops. This practice ensured synchronization between community labor and environmental cycles. Unlike written calendars that required training to interpret, the Renu's visual astronomical markers were universally accessible. The spiral tillers also applied their principles to water conservation. They dug ascending wells on inner spiral edges, allowing groundwater to rise slowly and evenly. Instead of extracting water aggressively, they let it seep gradually into catchment basins. This prevented aquifer depletion and kept water temperature cool, ideal for drinking and irrigation. Many of these wells were lined with stone rings arranged in gentle curves to prevent collapse and regulate water pressure. Later island cultures that settled near the abandoned Renu lands adopted these wells, citing their reliability even during long droughts. Culturally, the Renu viewed farming not as labor but as a form of knowledge preservation. Each terrace spiral served as a historical record. The shape of a curve indicated the generation that built it. The thickness of walls reflected the abundance or scarcity during specific eras. Elders taught children how to read spirals like timelines, interpreting structural variations as indicators of climatic events. This unique form of environmental memory allowed the Renu to adapt more quickly to changing conditions. When wet periods shortened, they widened inner terraces to store more water. When solar patterns shifted, they adjusted curvature angles to balance light distribution. Despite their resilience, the society faced a slow decline when volcanic ashfall dramatically altered sunlight exposure. Extended periods of atmospheric opacity reduced the effectiveness of microclimates. Outer spiral crops failed repeatedly due to insufficient heat. Ash also clogged water channels, making spirals too dense for proper runoff. The Renu attempted adjustments, steeper arcs, deeper channels, more shade crops, but prolonged volcanic activity overwhelmed the system. Their society gradually dispersed, with groups migrating to greener islands. Yet, the legacy of the spiral tillers continues through their engineering principles. Modern landscape architects studying their terraces note that the logarithmic patterns mirror efficient designs used today in solar farms, erosion control, and regenerative agriculture. Their approach demonstrates how ancient societies achieved stability through observation rather than advanced tools. The Renu spiral tillers represent a civilization that mastered ecological geometry, integrating mathematics, agriculture, hydrology, and climate observation into a single unified system. Their spirals functioned like living machines, capturing sunlight, regulating water, retaining soil, and preserving cultural memory. Their achievements reveal how a society can thrive by aligning its practices with natural patterns rather than resisting them.
The ashtar and kelp forest guilds existed along a drowned chain of basalt shelves where cold currents met warm volcanic plumes, creating underwater forests so dense they formed natural corridors. Their settlements were built in vertical layers, anchored to stone ridges, with woven kelp walls that swayed but never broke. The guilds operated like quiet cooperatives, relying on biological engineering rather than metal tools. They bred kelp strands that could glow softly at night, opening and contracting like lungs, illuminating pathways and helping them navigate the deeper valleys. Their records were preserved in spiraled shells, etched with magnetic patterns rather than markings, readable only when placed against a specific coral plate that amplified the encoded vibrations. Those shell archives survived in fragments, discovered in caves long after the guilds vanished, offering faint echoes of their environmental mastery. Their society understood tidal motion as a living rhythm. Every guild member trained in reading microcurrents that shifted through the forest, allowing them to detect approaching storms days before surface dwellers noticed. Their trade routes passed through tunnels formed by centuries of kelp growth, and these routes were patrolled by gentle manta shields, massive fish domesticated to guide travelers by responding to hand signs. The Ashtaran believed their survival depended on remaining unnoticed by outside forces, so they hid their settlements using synchronized bioluminescent patterns that mimic the natural glow of plankton blooms. When predators or outsiders approached, the kelp forest dimmed instantly. This control allowed them to create what explorers later called the invisible cities, though no complete structure was ever found intact. What remains today are isolated kelp stalk foundations fused with volcanic rock, showing engineered root patterns that match no natural species. Their nutrition came from layered farming, slow-growing mineral sponges that absorbed metals from the water, cultivated mollusks with enlarged nutrient glands, and drifting vine pods bred to trap microalgae. Their metabolic understanding was advanced, so they could adjust the mineral content of their food to treat illnesses. Oral accounts from later coastal cultures speak of sea healers who could calm fevers, mend fractures, and treat poisoning with extracts made from their farms. The Ashtaran guilds shared these treatments with outsiders only in rare circumstances, typically during climatic disasters when coastal people struggled with disease. But these exchanges were minimal, always conducted through proxy swimmers who never revealed the true location of their homes. One of their greatest achievements was the current loom, an array of anchored kelp braids that stretched for hundreds of meters. When tides flowed through it, the tension of the strands produced vibrations that traveled long distances underwater. These vibrations formed a communication network similar to low-frequency telegraphy. Guilds miles apart could interpret the patterns, which varied in pitch, rhythm, and amplitude. Some researchers estimate the system allowed communication across at least 70 kilometers, surpassing even some early human acoustic technologies. Yet the loom depended on perfect ecological conditions. As currents shifted over centuries, parts of it collapsed into deep trenches. What remains is still able to produce faint tones when divers disturb the water, though the language itself is lost. Their decline appears tied to seismic instability. Volcanic fissures opened beneath their forests, releasing heat and toxins that damaged the kelp foundations. The Ashtaran tried adapting by cultivating heat-resistant strains, but records carved into the surviving shells suggest they were overwhelmed by a series of rapid shifts. The forests thinned, predators migrated, and the water chemistry altered too quickly for their engineered life to keep pace. Instead of abandoning their settlements piecemeal, evidence suggests a coordinated final migration. Several coastal myths describe glowing processions moving silently through the deep, heading toward the western trenches, where light fades completely. Whether they intended to rebuild or simply vanish remains unknown. No confirmed Ashtaran structures exist beyond those trenches. Archaeobiologists studying the forests discovered kelp strands containing unusual protein sequences, clearly the result of artificial selection. These sequences allowed the kelp to anchor more deeply, resist tearing, and communicate chemical signals across long distances. Some believe the Ashtaran used these networks as ecological monitors, reading changes in ocean health with precision we still struggle to achieve. The guilds treated their environment not as a resource, but as a partner.
Every structure, every farm, and every tool was intertwined with the living fabric of the forest. This relationship allowed them to maintain stability for far longer than many civilizations on land. In their worldview, survival required harmony rather than dominance, and imbalance was considered a form of illness. Attempts to map their territory using sonar have revealed symmetrical formations beneath silt layers, suggesting there may still be intact installations sealed off from collapse. These formations sit deep enough to make exploration extremely difficult. The pressure exceeds standard dive limits, and robotic units often malfunction due to magnetic interference from the basalt fields. Some theories propose that the Ashtaran integrated magnetite into their structures to improve stability during tidal surges. If true, this could explain the interference, but also hints at a level of material science beyond what coastal cultures recorded at the time. Still, the guilds left behind no large monuments, no obvious tools, and no weapons. Their legacy is entirely biological, ecological, and acoustic. Their disappearance shaped later maritime traditions. Fishermen spoke of ghost forests that glowed faintly during calm nights, and some early navigators claimed to hear distant vibrations that resembled the loom. These stories persisted for centuries before fading into folklore. Yet modern divers occasionally report unnatural silence near the basalt fields, as if sound itself is absorbed by unseen structures. Whether this is psychological or evidence of deeper remnants is still debated. The Ashtar and Kelp Forest guilds remain one of the clearest examples of a civilization whose wisdom depended not on expansion, but on secrecy, adaptation, and attunement to the sea. Their final legacy may be a reminder that entire societies can thrive without ever leaving behind towering relics. As this exploration of the 19 civilizations concludes, the purpose of the journey becomes clear. Knowledge, even when fragmented, inspires curiosity, reflection, and a calm wonder that lingers long after the facts fade. If this series has given you peace, fascination, or a soft space to rest, then its purpose is fulfilled. When you're ready, explore more stories, more mysteries, and more restful science with this channel. Your support keeps these long-form, sleep-aiding, deeply researched narratives alive. If you enjoyed this series, consider subscribing, leaving a gentle comment, or sharing it with someone who also seeks calm, quiet discovery. Your presence here matters, and the journey continues because of you.